In the shadowed valleys where the Pyrenees meet the Bay of Biscay, there exists a people whose origins confound every theory of European migration and settlement. The Basques stand alone, an island of linguistic and genetic distinctiveness in a continent swept repeatedly by Indo-European expansion. Their language shares no common ancestor with any other tongue on earth, and their blood carries signatures from a time before the great agricultural revolutions reshaped human civilization. To understand the Basques is to peer into a mirror reflecting the deepest European past. A past that elsewhere has been buried beneath wave after wave of conquest and cultural replacement. The land itself seems designed for preservation. Steep mountains rise abruptly from the sea, creating natural fortresses that have sheltered populations for tens of thousands of years. Rivers carve deep gorges through limestone and granite, isolating valleys from one another and from the broader movements of history. The climate shifts dramatically within short distances, from wet Atlantic coasts to Mediterranean foothills, creating ecological diversity that supported human communities even during ice ages. This geography would prove crucial, offering refuge when the rest of Europe transformed. Modern genetic studies revealed something extraordinary. Basque populations carry unusually high frequencies of haplogroups associated with Paleolithic European hunter-gatherers. Genetic markers that elsewhere in Europe have been diluted by successive migrations. When farmers from Anatolia spread across the continent some 8,000 years ago, bringing agriculture and new bloodlines, they seem to have made less impact in the Basque territories. When Bronze Age pastoralists swept in from the steppes 3,000 years later, the genetic signature again shows muted influence in this corner of Europe. The Basques represent a thread of continuity stretching back to the original human colonization of the continent after the last glacial maximum. The implications stagger the imagination. While most European populations descend primarily from Neolithic farmers mixed with steppe herders, Basques retain proportions of ancestry from people who hunted mammoth and painted caves. They are not unchanged, for no population remains static across millennia, but they preserve genetic echoes that have grown faint elsewhere. Studies of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes consistently place Basque populations as outliers in European genetic landscapes. They cluster with ancient samples extracted from Paleolithic and Mesolithic sites, showing relationships that post-date farming populations lack. This genetic peculiarity finds its parallel in language. Euskara, as Basques call their tongue, resists classification into any known language family. Linguists have proposed connections to Caucasian languages, to pre-Indo-European Iberian tongues, even to languages of the Caucasus Mountains, but none withstand scrutiny. Euskara appears genuinely isolated, a sole survivor of whatever linguistic landscape existed in Europe before Indo-European languages arrived. The language preserves features considered archaic, including an ergative absolutive case system, rare in European languages, and a complexity of verbal conjugation that challenges learners. Some researchers suggest Euskara represents a descendant of languages spoken across much of Western Europe before Indo-European expansion. True, then in learning Basque words for mountain, river, and stone, we approach sounds that may have echoed through Paleolithic camps. The language contains no inherited words for typical agricultural implements or domesticated animals beyond dogs, suggesting its structure solidified before the Neolithic Revolution. Words for metalworking and advanced technology entered Euskara as borrowings, maintaining a core vocabulary rooted in hunting, gathering, and an ancient relationship with the landscape. The famous painted caves of Franco-Cantabrian region, including Altamira, just east of Basque territory, and Lascaux to the north, represent the artistic achievement of Magdalenian culture. These Paleolithic peoples created stunning polychrome images of bison, horses, and deer between 17,000 and 12,000 years ago. While we cannot definitively claim these artists as direct Basque ancestors, the geographic proximity and genetic evidence suggest continuity. The hands pressed against cave walls in red ochre may belong to people whose descendants still inhabit these mountains, speaking a language that carries forward something of their worldview. Archaeological evidence supports long-term habitation. Cave sites throughout Basque Country show continuous or near-continuous occupation spanning tens of thousands of years. Stone tools follow recognizable technological progressions from Mousterian through Ornation to Magdalenian traditions. The archaeological record shows people adapting to climate fluctuations, shifting from reindeer hunting during cold periods to focusing on red deer and boar when forests returned. Through all these environmental changes, human presence persisted in the same valleys and cave systems. The transition to agriculture came late and incompletely to Basque territories, while farming communities established themselves across Iberia by 6,000 years ago. Mountain valleys maintained mixed economies, combining cultivation with continued hunting and gathering. The rugged terrain suited pastoralism more than intensive agriculture, encouraging mobile herding patterns that persisted into historical times. This partial adoption of agricultural lifeways may explain the genetic patterns as incoming farmers intermarried with, but did not replace, existing populations. Bronze Age cultures left their mark through dolmens and stone circles scattered across Basque hills. These megalithic monuments, built between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago, demonstrate participation in broader European traditions while maintaining local characteristics. The effort required to move massive stones and construct burial chambers indicates organized societies with surplus labor. Yet these communities retained linguistic and cultural elements, connecting them to deeper pasts. Even as they adopted new technologies and social structures, Akanid settlements show increasing complexity. Kill forts crowned defensive positions, controlling valley routes and resource areas. Material culture reveals trade connections extending to Mediterranean civilizations, with Greek and later Roman goods appearing in archaeological contexts. Yet written sources from these civilizations, when they finally mention the peoples of the Pyrenees, describe them as distinct and difficult to subdue. The ethnic landscape of Iron Age Iberia included numerous groups, but those in the Western Pyrenees already showed characteristics later associated with Basques. The mystery deepens when considering blood types. Case populations have the highest frequencies worldwide of Rh-negative blood, particularly type O-negative. This distribution pattern suggests isolation and genetic drift over long periods. While Rh-negative blood appears in all European populations, its concentration among Basques reaches levels found nowhere else. Population geneticists view this as evidence of a relatively small founding population that grew while maintaining reproductive isolation from surrounding groups. Cranial measurements and skeletal analyses from ancient burial sites in Basque Country show morphological continuity. Physical anthropologists note consistent features appearing in remains from Neolithic through medieval periods, suggesting biological continuity alongside cultural persistence. While interpreting skeletal evidence requires caution, the data support the genetic findings of long-term population stability. The people inhabiting these mountains changed through time, but without the wholesale replacement that occurred in many European regions. Climate shaped this story profoundly. During glacial maxima, when ice sheets covered northern Europe, the Basque region offered refuge. The coastal areas remained ice-free, providing access to marine resources even during the coldest periods. Valleys running north-south allowed movement between climate zones, giving populations flexibility to adjust to environmental stress when ice retreated and forests expanded. These same valleys maintained the communities that had persisted through harsh millennia. The relationship between geography and cultural survival cannot be overstated. Mountains create barriers to military conquest and cultural assimilation. Linguistic borders often follow mountain ranges, as difficult terrain impedes communication and travel. For Basques, the Pyrenees provided not just physical protection, but also ecological diversity, supporting independent economic systems. People controlling both coastal fishing grounds and mountain pastures could resist incorporation into larger political units. Language preservation requires more than isolation. It demands active transmission across generations and cultural pride in distinctiveness. Basque communities developed strong local identities tied to specific valleys and towns. The Basque system of family farmsteads created social structures emphasizing lineage and land inheritance patterns that reinforced cultural continuity. When children learned euskara at home and used it in all aspects of daily life, they maintained a linguistic boundary that military force could not easily cross. Religious practices before Christianity probably differed from Mediterranean paganism. Hints survive in folklore and place names, suggesting veneration of natural features and female deities. The goddess Mari appears in traditions as a powerful figure associated with weather and mountains, possibly reflecting pre-Christian beliefs adapted to Catholic overlay. Cave sites held special significance, continuing perhaps from Paleolithic times when caves offered both shelter and numinous space for ritual activities. The Roman period would test this cultural resilience. Its legions conquered Iberia and Gaul. They encountered in the Pyrenees a people who would not submit easily. Roman writers noted the fierceness of these mountain warriors and the incomprehensibility of their speech. Yet Roman roads would eventually penetrate the valleys, bringing new influences even to isolated communities. The question became not whether external forces would reach Basque territories, but whether Basque identity could survive contact with Mediterranean civilization. Archaeological evidence from the Roman period shows selective adoption of Roman culture. Basque elites learned Latin and participated in imperial systems, but rural populations maintained traditional practices. Burial customs, settlement patterns, and material culture show Roman influence alongside persistent local traditions. The relationship resembled a frontier zone where different cultures mixed without one completely absorbing the other. Latin would eventually evolve into Romance languages that surrounded Basque territory, but Euskara endured in its core regions. The genetic evidence suggests minimal Roman-era population replacement. While soldiers, merchants, and administrators moved through Basque lands, they left limited genetic legacy. The population bottlenecks and expansions visible in genetic data elsewhere in Europe appear muted in Basque samples. This pattern indicates that even as Rome incorporated these territories administratively, demographic impact remained modest. Local populations adapted to imperial rule without losing the biological distinctiveness that marked them. Understanding early Basque history requires piecing together fragments from multiple disciplines. Archaeology provides material evidence of continuous habitation and cultural practices. Linguistics analyzes language, structure, and vocabulary to infer ancient lifeways. Genetics traces ancestry through molecular markers unchanged by cultural shifts. Historical texts, though written by outsiders, offer glimpses of how Romans and others perceived these mysterious peoples. Each line of evidence alone provides incomplete pictures, but together they reveal a remarkable story of persistence. Question of origin remains open. Did Basques descend from the very first humans to colonize Europe after the Ice Ages? Or do they represent a later population that adopted the language of earlier inhabitants? Current evidence suggests the former, but certainty eludes us. What we know with confidence is that by the time written history begins, Basques already occupied their traditional lands and already spoke a language unlike any other. They had already survived every catastrophe and transformation that swept across Europe for thousands of years. This survival required more than luck or geography. It demanded cultural strategies for maintaining identity across generations, economic systems suited to local ecology, and social structures that valued tradition while allowing necessary adaptation. Basque communities developed all these elements over vast stretches of time. They created a way of life so well adapted to their mountain environment that external pressures could modify but not destroy it. In doing so, they preserved for us a living link to Europe's deepest past, a culture carrying forward elements from times we can barely imagine. When Roman legions marched into Iberia in the 3rd century before the Common Era, they encountered a patchwork of peoples with varying degrees of organization and resistance. The conquest proceeded systematically from the Mediterranean coast inland, subduing Iberians and Celti-Iberians through campaigns that lasted generations. Yet, as Roman control extended toward the northern mountains, the legions found populations who proved far more difficult to incorporate into the expanding empire. These peoples of the Western Pyrenees, whom Romans would call Vascones, represented a challenge unlike others Rome had faced in the peninsula. The earliest Roman references to these mountain dwellers come from military accounts and geographic descriptions. Writers like Strabo and Pliny, the elder, noted tribes inhabiting the difficult terrain between the Ebro River and the Atlantic coast. The Vascones occupied territory roughly corresponding to modern Navarre and adjacent areas, while related groups like the Aquitani lived north of the mountains in what is now southwestern France. Roman sources describe these peoples as fierce warriors who knew their mountain terrain intimately and used that knowledge to devastating effect against organized armies. Geography dictated military realities. Roman legions excelled on open ground, where discipline and formation tactics provided overwhelming advantages. Mountain warfare negated these strengths, favoring small bands who could strike from concealed positions and vanish into valleys before reinforcements arrived. The Pyrenees offered countless places for ambush, and local fighters understood every pass and hidden path. Roman commanders found themselves leading columns through narrow defiles, where enemy action could mean disaster. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin, and traditional military responses proved inadequate. The Cantabrian Wars of the late 1st century, before the Common Era, brought Rome into direct conflict with northern Iberian peoples. Augustus himself took command of campaigns aimed at pacifying the last unconquered regions of the peninsula. These brutal wars lasted a decade and required multiple legions to subdue fierce resistance, while the Cantabri and Astures bore the brunt of Roman military action. Vascones' territories lay adjacent to the conflict zone. The outcome demonstrated Rome's determination to control all Iberia, regardless of cost. Yet control over Vascones' lands remained incomplete and contested. Rome established roads through the Western Pyrenees and founded garrison towns to maintain presence. The city that would become Pamplona, called Pamplona by Romans, served as an administrative center. Roman infrastructure penetrated the region, but effective control varied greatly between lowland areas accessible to military force and mountain strongholds where imperial authority reached only nominally. Vascones never faced the systematic conquest that broke other Iberian peoples. This partial incorporation into the empire created a frontier zone where Roman and indigenous cultures mixed uneasily. Vascones' elites learned Latin and adopted Roman customs that benefited them politically and economically. Inscriptions from the Roman period show Vascones' names rendered in Latin characters, evidence of literacy spreading among leading families. Some Vascones served in Roman military units, gaining citizenship and connections to imperial systems. Yet these adaptations occurred primarily among upper classes in accessible areas, while rural mountain populations maintained traditional lifeways. Roman writers struggled to understand Vascone society and language. The few Vascones words preserved in Latin texts show the same linguistic strangeness that characterizes modern Euskara. Personal names, place names, and deity names all appear alien to Indo-European patterns familiar to Roman scribes. This linguistic gulf reinforced Roman perceptions of Vascones as fundamentally foreign and uncivilized. Despite their willingness to engage in trade and selective cooperation with imperial authorities north of the mountains, the Aquitani presented similar challenges to Roman governors of Gaul. Caesar himself noted during the Gallic Wars that Aquitani differed from Celtic Gauls in language and customs. Their territory extended from the Pyrenees to the Garonne River, encompassing lands that would later become Gascony. Like the Vasconi, maintained cultural distinctiveness even as they accommodated Roman rule. The linguistic and cultural similarities between Aquitani and Vascones suggest they formed a continuum of related peoples, divided by the mountains, but sharing common origins. Roman administration in these regions relied heavily on existing social structures. Imperial officials preferred to work through local leaders rather than imposing direct rule requiring constant military presence. This approach, practical in difficult terrain, allowed Vascoines and Aquitani communities considerable autonomy in internal affairs. They paid taxes, provided troops when demanded, accepted Roman legal authority, but daily life continued following traditional patterns. The Basques farmstead system, extended family structures, and local customary law all persisted beneath the veneer of Roman governance. Trade flourished despite cultural differences. Roman coins circulated in Vascones territory, and archaeological evidence shows Roman pottery, metalwork, and other goods reaching mountain valleys. Wine and olive oil from Mediterranean regions found markets among northern peoples, while Vascones exported wool, iron, and other mountain products. This commercial integration brought wealth to some communities and increased contact with the Roman culture. Yet, material exchanges alone could not erase linguistic and cultural boundaries that had existed for millennia. Religious transformation came gradually and incompletely. Roman polytheism proved relatively tolerant of local deities, often identifying native gods with Roman equivalents through Interpretatio Romana. Some Vascones adopted worship of Roman gods, or blended Roman and indigenous practices. However, the mountains remained strongholds of traditional beliefs. Evidence suggests continued veneration of nature, spirits, and female deities associated with earth and water. Christianity's arrival would eventually supplant paganism, but that transformation lay centuries in the future. The 3rd century brought crisis to the Roman Empire. Political instability, economic decline, and pressure from Germanic peoples along the Rhine and Danube frontiers weakened imperial control over peripheral regions. In Iberia, central authority frayed as military commanders competed for power and local populations faced increased demands for taxes and soldiers. For Vascones and Aquitani, Roman weakness created opportunities to assert greater independence. Raids into lowland areas under Roman control began prefiguring the more dramatic upheavals to come. Germanic migrations of the 5th century transformed Western Europe politically and demographically. In Hispania, Vandals, Alans, and Suevi crossed the Pyrenees and established kingdoms on Roman territory. The Visigoths followed, eventually creating a kingdom that encompassed most of the peninsula. These migrations swept away Roman administration, but left Vascons' lands largely untouched. The mountain peoples maintained their territories through the same strategies that had preserved them under Rome: defensive geography, military readiness, and willingness to raid neighbors when opportunity presented. Visigothic kings found Vascones as difficult to control as Romans had. Chronicles from the Visigothic period record repeated military expeditions into Vascones' territory, attempts to subdue populations who refused vassalage. These campaigns achieved temporary successes, but never permanent conquest. Vascones' warriors raided Visigothic settlements in the Ebro Valley and beyond, seizing plunder and asserting independence. The Visigoths, themselves struggling to maintain control over a fractious kingdom, could not dedicate sufficient resources to pacifying the mountains. Christianity spread through Vascones' lands during this period, though the process remains poorly documented. Bishops established sees in accessible towns like Pamplona, creating ecclesiastical structures that paralleled political authority. The church offered advantages to local elites, providing literacy, connections to broader Christian networks, and ideological legitimacy. Rural populations converted more slowly, and pre-Christian elements persisted in folk practices and beliefs. The transition from paganism to Christianity unfolded across generations, marked by syncretic blending rather than abrupt transformation. The rise of Islam reshaped Iberia, beginning in 711, when Muslim armies crossed from North Africa and rapidly conquered the Visigothic kingdom. Within a few years, Islamic forces controlled most of the peninsula, establishing Al-Andalus as a vibrant center of medieval civilization. Yet, the conquest faltered in the Pyrenees. Muslim expeditions probed into the mountains and reached into southern Francia, but sustained control over Vascon's territories eluded them. The mountains again provided refuge, this time from Islamic expansion rather than Roman legions. Frankish power expanded from the north as the Carolingian dynasty created an empire spanning much of Western Europe. Charlemagne's campaigns pushed into Iberia, seeking to establish buffer zones against Muslim expansion. In 778, Frankish forces withdrew through the pass at Roncesvalles when Vascoins' warriors ambushed the rearguard, destroying it completely. This battle, embellished in later epic poetry as the Death of Roland, demonstrated that Vascons would resist Frankish domination as they had resisted all previous attempts at conquest. The episode reveals important aspects of Vascons' political culture. They fought not for Islam against Christianity, or vice versa, but for their own independence against any external power seeking control. Alliances shifted pragmatically based on perceived threats and opportunities. When Frankish armies represented the greater danger, Vascons opposed them regardless of religious considerations. This political flexibility, combined with military capability and geographic advantages, allowed survival in a world of competing empires. By the 9th century, the political landscape of the Pyrenees stabilized somewhat. Frankish power established the Spanish March along the eastern Pyrenees, creating counties like Barcelona that would evolve into independent entities. In the western Pyrenees, a Vascons polity emerged that would become the Kingdom of Navarre. This transformation from tribal territories to a recognizable kingdom marked a new phase in Basque history. Though the cultural continuity with earlier periods remained strong, the transition to Christian feudalism brought significant changes to social organization. Military leaders consolidated power, claiming authority over territories and peoples previously organized through kinship and customary law. The church provided ideological support for this emerging hierarchy, blessing kings and nobles while extending ecclesiastical administration through parishes and monasteries. Yet beneath these new structures, older patterns persisted. Extended families continued managing their Basque farmsteads according to inheritance customs predating feudalism, and Euskara remained the language of daily life despite Latin's prestige. Legal traditions showed remarkable continuity. The fueros, those bodies of customary law that would become central to Basque identity, had roots stretching back before written records. These legal codes recognized local autonomy, limited aristocratic power, and preserved community rights to common resources. While fueros received written codification in the medieval period, they represented the formalization of much older practices. Kings confirmed fueros as part of bargains trading recognition of royal authority for guarantees of local privileges. The archaeological record from the late Roman and early medieval periods shows both change and continuity. Settlement patterns shifted as hilltop fortifications gave way to valley locations once security improved. Material culture incorporated new elements while maintaining local ceramic traditions and building techniques. Burial practices evolved with Christian influence, yet mortuary customs retained pre-Christian aspects. Each generation adapted to changing circumstances while preserving core elements of identity passed down from their ancestors. Language remained the most visible marker of distinctiveness. While Latin evolved into Romance dialects across most of Iberia and Francia, Euskara persisted in the mountains. Bilingualism increased as contacts with Latin-speaking populations grew, but Basque remained dominant in its core territories. The language's survival through the Roman period and Germanic migrations meant it would endure. Already having weathered the greatest threats to its existence, by the early Middle Ages, Basque linguistic territory likely reached its greatest extent, spoken from the Atlantic to areas well east of modern Basque country. The story of Basque encounter with Rome and its successor states illustrates a fundamental pattern. External powers could project force into Basque territories and extract limited submission, but could not achieve the cultural transformation that incorporated most other European peoples into Latin civilization. Geography enabled this resistance, but geography alone does not explain it. Cultural cohesion, military prowess, and adaptability all played essential roles. Basques took from outsiders what served their purposes: technology, trade goods, Christianity, while maintaining the linguistic and cultural core that defined them. This pattern would repeat across centuries. Each new power attempting to incorporate Basque lands would discover the same difficulties that had frustrated Rome. The mountains made conquest expensive and control uncertain. Local populations could retreat to defensible positions and sustain resistance indefinitely. More importantly, cultural boundaries proved more enduring than political ones. A people could accept a king's authority while maintaining their language, customs, and self-understanding as distinct. The genius of Basque political culture lay in this flexibility, knowing when to accommodate external power and when to resist. The 9th century witnessed the crystallization of Basque political power into a kingdom that would dominate the Pyrenees for centuries. Kingdom of Navarre emerged from the consolidation of Vascon's territories under leaders who successfully balanced independence against the pressures of Carolingian Francia to the north and the Islamic powers of Al-Andalus to the south. What began as a highland polity centered on Pamplona would expand to become one of medieval Iberia's most significant powers, Aplorius, claiming authority over lands stretching from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean at the kingdom's zenith. The early Navarrese kings built their power on foundations laid by generations of resistance to external domination. Inigo Arista, recognized as the first king in the early 9th century, established a dynasty that would rule for 200 years. These monarchs governed not as absolute rulers, but through negotiation with powerful families controlling valleys and regions. The king's authority rested on military success, the ability to distribute rewards, and respect for customary laws that limited royal power. This contractual relationship between rulers and subjects would characterize Basque political culture for centuries to come. Navarre's strategic position between Christian and Muslim powers allowed skilled diplomacy to amplify military strength. Navarrese kings allied sometimes with Frankish powers, sometimes with Muslim rulers, always seeking advantage in the complex politics of early medieval Iberia. The kingdom served as a buffer and intermediary, its control of mountain passes giving it leverage in regional conflicts. This position brought both wealth through tolls and trade, and danger as competing powers sought to control or destroy a kingdom that could tip regional balances. The Reconquista, that centuries-long process by which Christian kingdoms pushed back Islamic control of Iberia, provided context for Navarre's expansion. While later, nationalist historiography would frame the Reconquista as a unified crusade. The reality involved complex and shifting alliances where religious identity mattered less than political advantage. Navarrese forces fought alongside and against both Christian and Muslim armies as circumstances dictated. The kingdom expanded opportunistically, seizing territories when weakness invited aggression, consolidating gains through strategic marriages and treaties. Sancho III, called the Great, ruled Navarre from 1004 to 1035 and brought the kingdom to its greatest extent. Through inheritance, conquest, and political maneuvering, Sancho controlled or influenced territories spanning from Galicia to Catalonia. He held the title King of Navarre, but exercised authority over Castile, Aragon, and much of Christian Iberia. His court became a center of culture and learning, attracting scholars and clergy from across Europe. For a brief moment, a king whose primary language was Basque commanded an empire dominating the peninsula. Sancho's achievement rested on personal ability rather than institutional foundations capable of outlasting him. Upon his death, the empire fragmented as different territories went to different sons. Navarre proper went to Garcia Sanchez III, while Castile, Aragon, and other regions passed to other heirs who quickly established independent rule. This partition reflected medieval inheritance customs, but also demonstrated the limits of personal monarchy without bureaucratic structures or unified identity across diverse territories. Empires built on conquest dissolved when the conqueror died. The division proved catastrophic for Navarre's long-term prospects. Castile and Aragon, initially subordinate to Navarre, grew into powerful kingdoms that would dominate later medieval Iberia. Navarre, reverting to its core Basque territories, could not match their resources or military power. The kingdom that had briefly commanded an empire found itself squeezed between expanding neighbors who viewed Navarre's independence as obstacle to their own ambitions. Yet, for another 4 centuries, Navarre would maintain sovereignty through skilled diplomacy and exploitation of rivalries between Castile and Aragon. A way of St. James transformed Navarre economically and culturally. This pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela became one of medieval Europe's most important religious journeys, bringing thousands of pilgrims through Navarrese territory annually. Columns along the route prospered from providing services to travelers, and the constant flow of pilgrims exposed Basque regions to broader European culture. Churches and monasteries built to serve pilgrims introduced Romanesque and later Gothic architecture. French settlers established communities along the route, creating multicultural towns where Basque, Romance, and other languages mixed. The Camino de Santiago served economic functions beyond spiritual ones. Merchants traveled with pilgrims, establishing trade networks linking Navarre to markets across Christian Europe. Ideas and technologies flowed along the route, bringing innovations in agriculture, craft production, and military techniques. The kingdom's economy diversified beyond pastoralism and subsistence farming. As towns grew and commerce expanded, economic development concentrated along pilgrimage routes in lowland areas, while mountain valleys remained more traditional in economy and culture. Religious architecture along the pilgrimage route reflected both European trends and local adaptations. The Cathedral of Pamplona and dozens of churches demonstrated Navarrese participation in broader Christian culture while incorporating regional elements. Stone carvers created capitals and Timuna, mixing biblical scenes with local motifs. The kingdom's churches served as visible statements of Christian identity and royal power. Yet, their construction employed local labor following building traditions adapted from earlier periods. Sacred spaces reflected layered identities, simultaneously Basque, Christian, and European. The fueros gained formal recognition and written codification during the medieval period, though their origins reached back to pre-Roman times. These legal codes recognized rights and privileges of different communities, limiting royal and aristocratic power through guarantee of customary law. The fueros granted towns and regions considerable autonomy in governance, taxation, and justice. Protected common resources from privatization, regulated inheritance to prevent fragmentation of family farms, and established legal equality among free persons regardless of wealth. Kings confirmed fueros as condition of receiving recognition, creating contractual relationships between rulers and subjects. Different regions possessed different fueros, reflecting local circumstances and negotiating power. Coastal areas had maritime fueros governing fishing rights and naval service. Mountain valleys had fueros protecting communal pastures and regulating transhumance. Towns had urban fueros establishing market rights and self-governance. This legal pluralism recognized diversity within Basque society while maintaining shared commitment to limiting arbitrary authority. The fueros became central to Basque identity, representing both legal rights and cultural values, emphasizing liberty and local autonomy. Defense of fueros motivated political action across centuries. When kings attempted to exceed their authority or reduce privileges, communities resisted through legal appeals, refusal of service, or rebellion. The contractual nature of Basque political culture meant rulers governed with consent, not just force. This tradition limited centralization and preserved local power structures, even as medieval society generally trended toward concentrated authority. Basques understood their relationship to kings as mutual obligation, not submission. Can proved willing to defend that understanding through whatever means necessary. The Kingdom of Navarre's relationship with neighboring Castile and Aragon oscillated between cooperation and conflict. Marriage alliances linked royal families, creating claims and counterclaims to territories and thrones. Wars erupted periodically as kingdoms sought to adjust borders or exploit moments of weakness. Treaties established temporary equilibria before new circumstances brought renewed conflict. Through these struggles, Navarre gradually lost territory and influence, yet the kingdom's diplomatic skill and the difficulty of conquering mountain strongholds preserved core independence. The 12th and 13th centuries brought increasing pressure as Castile and Aragon consolidated power and pushed Islamic forces toward final defeat. The reconquest of Andalusia and Murcia by Castile and of Valencia and the Balearics by Aragon created powerful kingdoms with resources. Dwarfing Navarre's, the balance of power shifted decisively against the Basque kingdom. Navarre could no longer play competitors against each other effectively. As Castile and Aragon divided Iberia between them, with little space remaining for smaller kingdoms. Survival required careful navigation between more powerful neighbors who could destroy Navarre if it became convenient. Cultural developments paralleled political changes. Navarrese court culture during the High Middle Ages reflected broader European trends while maintaining distinctive elements. Troubadours performed Occitan poetry, introducing courtly love traditions. Chronicles recorded the kingdom's history in Latin and Romance languages. Yet Euskara remained the language of most subjects, and rural culture maintained continuities with earlier periods. A court in towns showed increasing Romance influence, while valleys and countryside preserved Basque, linguistic, and cultural dominance. Military service obligations under fueros meant Navarrese armies combined feudal levies with more ancient patterns of community-based mobilization. Knights provided heavy cavalry following standard medieval practice, but foot soldiers maintained fighting styles rooted in mountain warfare traditions. This military system proved effective for defense and small-scale operations, but could not match the large armies Castile and Aragon fielded. Navarre increasingly relied on fortifications and defensive strategy rather than offensive campaigns, a realistic adaptation to geopolitical constraints. The wool trade became increasingly important to Navarre's economy during the later medieval period. Sheep herding had always been central to Basque mountain economy, but growing demand for wool from textile centers in Flanders and Italy created new opportunities. Canaries wool, particularly fine merino, commanded premium prices. Pastoral communities organized into powerful associations, managing seasonal migrations between summer mountain pastures and winter lowlands. The wealth from world trade flowed into towns and supported royal revenues, creating economic interests linking Navarre to broader European commerce. Urban growth transformed some Basque towns during the High Middle Ages. Pamplona expanded beyond its Roman foundations to become a significant city with cathedral chapter, royal administration, and merchant community. San Sebastian and other coastal settlements grew as fishing ports and gained importance for trade with northern Europe. These urban centers became more cosmopolitan and Romance-speaking, creating cultural distance from rural hinterlands. The urban-rural divide that would later shape Basque politics began emerging, with towns looking outward to European markets and culture, while countryside maintained more traditional patterns. Monasteries played crucial roles in medieval Navarre. Religious houses like Lair and Iraqi preserved learning, managed agricultural estates, and provided education for elites. Monks and nuns came from noble families, giving monasteries political influence beyond their spiritual functions. These institutions promoted agricultural improvement, introducing new crops and techniques. They also served as centers for manuscript production, preserving texts that would otherwise have been lost. The church's institutional presence created parallel structures to secular authority, sometimes supporting royal power and sometimes checking it. Queens exercised significant power in medieval Navarre, more so than in most European kingdoms. Inheritance law allowed female succession, and several queens ruled in their own right. Berengaria of Navarre married Richard the Lionheart, but spent little time as Queen of England, focusing instead on governing her own lands. Strong queens reflected broader patterns in Basque society, where women held substantial rights regarding property and inheritance. The relative power of women distinguished Basque culture from neighboring societies where male primogeniture more strictly controlled succession and property. By the 14th century, Navarre's independence had become precarious. The kingdom survived through shifting alliances and exploitation of rivalries between France, Castile, and Aragon, but each generation brought new threats. Royal succession crises provided opportunities for foreign intervention as claimants sought external support. Territory continued eroding as more powerful neighbors seized border regions, yet the kingdom endured. Its survival, a testament to the diplomatic skill of its rulers and the determination of its people to maintain self-governance. The mountains that had sheltered Basque communities for millennia still offered some protection against overwhelming force. The Navarrese experience during the medieval period illustrates how small kingdoms could survive in a world of expanding powers through combination of geography. Kijin, the kingdom's rulers, understood their limitations and played the game of medieval politics with skill and realism. They preserved Basque autonomy not through quixotic resistance, but through careful calibration of when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to accommodate stronger powers. This political wisdom is combined with the military advantages of mountain warfare and the social cohesion provided by fueros and shared identity, kept Navarre independent centuries after similar small kingdoms disappeared. The Basque language stands alone in Europe, a survivor from linguistic landscapes that vanished elsewhere beneath waves of Indo-European expansion. Euskara carries no proven relationship to any other tongue on earth, making it what linguists call a language isolate. Its structure confounds speakers of Indo-European languages with verb conjugations that mark not just tense and person, but also the formality of relationships between speakers. The language employs an ergot absolutive case system, where the subject of transitive verbs receives different marking than subjects of intransitive verbs, a pattern rare in European languages, but common in Caucasian and some indigenous American tongues. Learning Euskara challenges outsiders through complexity that rewards years of study. The language builds words through agglutination, attaching prefixes and suffixes to roots in chains that pack multiple grammatical functions into single words. A verb form might simultaneously indicate who performs the action, who receives it, whether singular or plural, the tense, the mood, and the social relationship between participants. This density of information allows speakers to convey in a few words what might require entire clauses in other languages, but demands that learners master intricate systems before achieving fluency. Dialectal variation divides Euskara into several distinct forms, each associated with particular regions and valleys. Kayan, Kipako, and other dialects show enough differences that speakers from distant areas sometimes struggle to understand each other fully. This variation reflects historical isolation of communities separated by mountains, each developing linguistic peculiarities across centuries of limited contact. The creation of Batua, a standardized literary form, the 20th century provided a common written language while spoken. Dialects continue, reflecting local identities and attachments. The vocabulary of Euskara offers windows into ancient lifeways, core words for natural features, kinship, and basic activities show no borrowing from Indo-European sources, suggesting these terms existed before contact with Latin and Romance speakers. Words for technological innovations and cultural concepts entered as loanwords, marking historical moments when Basque society encountered new ideas. Latin contributed vocabulary related to law, religion, and administration. Later, Romance languages provided terms for commercial and political concepts. Yet the grammatical structure and basic vocabulary remained stubbornly non-Indo-European, preserving linguistic patterns from before Rome. Oral tradition flourished in Basque culture, transmitting knowledge, values, and identity across generations through spoken word and song. The Bertsolaritza tradition elevated improvised verse to high art form. Bertsolaris, the improvisational poets, create rhyming verses on assigned topics in real time, displaying verbal dexterity and quick wit before audiences that judged their skill. Competitions bring together Bertsolars who engage in poetic duels, each building on what the previous singer created while maintaining meter and rhyme. This tradition requires not just linguistic mastery, but also deep cultural knowledge to craft verses resonating with community values and experiences. The improvisational nature of Bertsolaritza meant each performance created something unique, never to be repeated exactly. This emphasis on spontaneous creation over fixed texts reflects oral culture's values and possibilities. Without writing, knowledge lived in memory and in the moment of telling or singing. The Bertsolari demonstrated ultimate mastery of language by creating structured verse without preparation, proving themselves worthy carriers of cultural tradition. Audiences appreciated both technical skill and content, demanding verses that entertained while conveying genuine insight or emotion. Mythology preserved in folklore reveals belief systems predating Christianity. The goddess Mari dwells in caves and mountain peaks, appearing as a beautiful woman, tree, whirlwind, or other forms. She controls weather and punishes those who violate social norms or show disrespect for nature. Mari's consort, Sugar, takes the form of a serpent or dragon, and their coupling brings storms and rain. This divine couple reflects pre-Christian cosmology, where female deities held primary power and natural phenomena manifested divine will. Christian missionaries could not entirely suppress these beliefs, which survived in stories and superstitions passed down through generations. Basajoni, the wild man of the woods, haunts forests and protects flocks from wolves and other predators. Stories describe him as covered in hair, possessing great strength, and knowing secrets of agriculture and metalworking. Some traditions claim Basajan taught humans to cultivate wheat and forge iron, gifts paralleling Prometheus's theft of fire in Greek mythology. The figure likely represents folk memory of pre-agricultural peoples, or perhaps Neanderthals, transformed through storytelling into protective spirits watching from the wild margins of settled lands. Other supernatural beings populate Basque folklore. Limiak, female spirits associated with rivers and springs, comb golden hair and help humans who treat them respectfully. Sorjanak, witches possessing real power, gather for nocturnal assemblies and can bring harm or healing. Kotagoryak, red-trousered creatures, build megalithic monuments and possess supernatural knowledge. These figures, along with dozens of others, created a rich, imaginative world where natural and supernatural realms interpenetrated. Every cave, spring, and ancient stone circle had its associated stories and spirits. The Basari system organized rural life around family farmsteads that combined residence, workspace, and connection to ancestral land. Each Basari passed intact through generations, typically to the child deemed most capable of managing it, regardless of birth, order, or gender. This inheritance pattern is called Etsiko Kojin or Etsiko Koander, depending on whether male or female inherited. Preserved farm units that might have been worked by the same family for centuries. Siblings not inheriting either married into other Basaris, left for towns, or joined church or military, but the farmstead itself remained undivided. Women held significant power within the Basari system, The Cocoander, the lady of the house, managed household economy and represented the family in community affairs if male family members were absent. Women inherited property, controlled dowries, and participated in legal proceedings. This relative gender equality contrasted with neighboring societies where patriarchy more strictly controlled women's lives. Some scholars suggest these patterns reflected pre-Indo-European social structures preserved in Basque culture alongside the ancient language. Though others argue the explanation lies in the mountain economy's demands rather than primordial customs. The Biscay provided both economic foundation and social identity. Families took their surnames from their farmsteads, linking personal identity to ancestral land. House name carried more weight than the family name, and marriages were sometimes described as one house allying with another, rather than two individuals joining. This deep connection between family and land created incentive to preserve farms intact and maintain them for future generations. The system fostered conservative social values, emphasizing continuity, responsibility, and long-term thinking over individual ambition or innovation. Architecture reflected practical needs and available materials. Basques typically featured stone ground floors, housing animals and equipment, with wooden upper floors for family quarters. Broad roofs protected walls from rain, and small windows reduced heat loss while providing necessary light. The layout placed the kitchen as the home's heart, where family gathered around the fire that burned year-round. Construction techniques, passed from generation to generation, maintained traditional forms even as tools and details evolved. Each valley developed recognizable architectural styles, allowing observers to identify a building's region from its proportions and details. Our communal resources and obligations balanced the Biscay system's emphasis on individual family holdings. Villages maintained common lands for grazing, timber, and other resources managed through traditional customs enforced by community consensus. Farmers cooperated for large tasks like harvest or barn raising that exceeded single families' capacity. These patterns of collective action created social cohesion despite the physical isolation of scattered farmsteads. The tension between individual property rights and communal obligations shaped Basque rural society, requiring constant negotiation and adjustment as circumstances changed. Basque maritime traditions extended back to prehistoric times, with coastal communities exploiting rich fishing grounds of the Bay of Biscay. Archaeological evidence shows fishing and whaling from at least the Roman period, and probably much earlier. Teased by the Middle Ages, Basque whalers had developed sophisticated techniques for hunting the northern right whale that migrated along Atlantic coasts. Ships pursued whales from shore stations, and when successful, processing operations yielded valuable oil for lamps, baleen for various uses, and meat. This dangerous work required skill, courage, and cooperation, creating maritime culture distinct from mountain pastoralism. The pursuit of whales took Basque sailors ever further from home as local populations declined from overhunting. By the 15th century, Basque whalers reached Newfoundland and Labrador, establishing seasonal shore stations for processing catches from abundant whale populations in northwestern Atlantic waters. These expeditions required vessels capable of ocean crossings and crews willing to spend months in harsh conditions far from home. The profits justified the risks, as whale products commanded high prices and successful voyages brought substantial wealth to ship owners and crews. Cod fishing developed alongside whaling as Basque sailors explored northwestern Atlantic waters. The Grand Banks off Newfoundland contained codfish stocks of almost unimaginable abundance. Hand-dried salt cod provided protein that could be stored for months without spoiling. This made cod valuable for provisioning ships and feeding populations far from coasts. Basque codfishers established temporary bases on Newfoundland and possibly along the Labrador coast, returning annually to exploit the fishery. Some evidence suggests Basque presence in these waters predated Columbus, though definitive proof remains elusive. The maritime ventures created networks linking Basque ports to international trade. Ships that carried salt cod to Mediterranean markets returned with wine, olive oil, and other goods unavailable locally. Merchants in ports like San Sebastian and Bilbao developed commercial relationships across Europe, bringing wealth and cosmopolitan perspectives to coastal communities. Maritime trade required literacy, numeracy, and commercial law, skills that spread through ports and influenced broader society. The sea offered opportunities for social mobility impossible in the rigid hierarchies of agricultural society. Shipbuilding emerged as major industry in Basque territories. The combination of excellent natural harbors, nearby forests providing timber, and accumulated expertise created competitive advantages. Basque shipyards produced vessels for both fishing fleets and naval forces, earning reputations for quality construction and seaworthy designs. The industry employed hundreds of craftsmen in sawing, shaping, and joining wood, along with specialists in making sails, rope, and metal fittings. Building towns prospered, developing distinct urban cultures centered on maritime activities. Naval service became another Basque specialty. Kings of Castile and other powers recruited Basque sailors and marines for their fleets, valuing their seamanship and fighting ability. Basque commanders lead squadrons and expeditions, some achieving fame and titles through naval victories. This service brought prestige and rewards, but also drew men away from communities for years at a time. The cost in lives lost to storm disease and combat could be devastating for small coastal towns that sent large proportions of their young men to sea. The Basque maritime world produced its own customs, vocabulary, and social structures distinct from those of interior valleys. Sailors developed superstitions and rituals designed to ensure safe voyages and good catches. A specialized vocabulary grew around ships, navigation, and sea conditions, with many Euskara terms for maritime concepts borrowed into Romance languages. Communities organized around the rhythms of fishing seasons and ship movements, with women managing households and businesses during long absences of men at sea. This created female independence and authority different from both interior Basari patterns and conventional European patriarchy. Language shifts accelerated in coastal areas due to constant contact with Romance-speaking merchants, officials, and settlers. Ports became bilingual zones where Euskara mixed with Castilian or French depending on political jurisdiction. Some families maintained Basque as home language while using Romance for business and administration. Others shifted primarily to Romance while retaining some Basque vocabulary and cultural identification. The linguistic frontier between Basque and Romance territories remained fluid, advancing and retreating based on economic opportunities, population movements, and political pressures. The 16th century brought the end of Navarre's independence and formal incorporation of Basque territories into the expanding Spanish and French monarchies. In 1512, Castilian forces invaded Navarre under pretext of preventing French influence, quickly occupying the kingdom and deposing its ruling dynasty. The conquest met limited resistance, as military realities made defense of the lowlands impossible against Castilian armies fresh from completing the Reconquista. Within a year, Navarre, south of the Pyrenees, became part of the Spanish monarchy, while northern territories fell to France, dividing the Basque homeland between two expanding powers. The loss of the kingdom might have meant cultural catastrophe, absorption into Castilian or French identity, as happened to so many conquered peoples. Yet, Basque communities survived incorporation through the fueros, those ancient legal codes guaranteeing local autonomy and rights. Spanish monarchs confirmed the fueros as condition of Navarre's acceptance of Castilian rule, creating contractual relationship rather than simple conquest. The Basque provinces maintained separate legal status within the Spanish monarchy, exempted from many royal taxes and military levies in exchange for voluntary contributions negotiated through provincial assemblies. This arrangement, while removing formal sovereignty, preserved substantial self-governance. The juntas, provincial assemblies, representing the hidalgo class and communities, controlled local administration, taxation, and justice. Royal officials could not implement policies without junta approval, and juntas could appeal directly to the monarch over heads of Castilian administrators. The provinces maintained customs barriers at the Ebro River rather than at the French border, treating Castile as foreign territory for trade purposes. This legal peculiarity reflected historical reality that Basque territories had been independent kingdoms and deserved recognition as distinct political entities. Hidalgos, the noble class, enjoyed universal status in Basque provinces under legal fiction that all Basques descended from families that had never submitted to Muslim rule. This universal hidalgo granted privileges, including exemption from torture, the right to bear arms, and access to positions normally restricted to nobility. The claim rested on shaky historical foundation, but Spanish monarchs accepted it as part of the fuero system. Universal nobility created unusual social structure where peasant farmers possessed legal status equal to wealthy merchants, at least in theory. Practice proved more complicated as economic power translated into political influence regardless of legal equality. The Spanish Empire's expansion created opportunities for ambitious Basques seeking fortune overseas. Basque sailors, soldiers, and administrators participated prominently in conquests and colonial administration across the Americas. Ships built in Basque yards carried conquistadors to the New World, and Basque captains commanded expeditions exploring Pacific coasts. Praying skills developed through cod fishing and whaling served Spain's imperial ambitions. Experienced mariners were essential for transoceanic voyages and naval warfare against rival powers. Basque immigrants established themselves throughout Spain's American empire. Some sought quick wealth through conquest and plunder. Others built commercial networks linking colonial economies to European markets. Basque merchants in ports like Veracruz, Lima, and Manila controlled significant portions of imperial trade, using family and regional connections to create business partnerships spanning oceans. Success in colonial ventures brought wealth flowing back to Basque territories, funding construction of elaborate townhouses and churches displaying newfound prosperity. The ironwork balconies and carved stone facades of colonial-era buildings still grace Basque towns, physical reminders of wealth generated across the Atlantic. The role in empire building carried moral complexity. Basques participated in conquest, exploitation, enslavement of indigenous peoples across the Americas and later in Asia. The wealth funding, elaborate architecture, and commercial ventures rested on suffering of millions subjected to colonial rule. Some Basques voiced criticism of colonial abuses, but most accepted the system enriching them. The embrace of empire demonstrated that maintaining distinct identity within Spain did not prevent full participation in Spanish imperial projects, however brutal their implementation. Ironworking represented another arena of Basque excellence. The mountains contained iron ore deposits, forests provided charcoal for smelting, and rivers powered trip hammers for forging. Centuries of accumulated expertise made Basque ironworkers among Europe's finest, producing tools, weapons, and architectural elements renowned for quality. Iron foundries in valleys like those of Biscay and Guipúzcoa operated continuously, their outputs supplying Spanish armies and finding markets across Europe. The industry employed thousands and generated wealth independent of maritime trade, creating economic diversification that strengthened overall prosperity. Technological innovation in iron production gave Basque foundries competitive advantages. The development of more efficient smelting techniques and improvements in forging tools increased output and quality. Skilled workers commanded high wages, and masters passed knowledge to apprentices through traditional guild structures. The industry created an industrial working class distinct from agricultural or maritime workers, concentrated in towns where foundries clustered. This early industrialization in the 16th and 17th centuries prefigured the more dramatic transformations that would come during the 19th century. Shipbuilding continued as major industry, adapting to changing demands as naval warfare evolved. Galleons, carrying silver from America to Spain, and treasure fleets protecting those cargoes required vessels. Combining cargo capacity with defensive capability, Basque shipyards specialize in constructing these warships, incorporating innovations in hull design and rigging that improve performance. The Spanish Armada of 1588 included numerous vessels built in Basque yards, testimony to the industry's importance for Spanish power. The Armada's defeat did not end shipbuilding prominence, as Spain's continued imperial ambitions required constant vessel replacement and expansion. Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order founded by Ignatius of Loyola, had distinctly Basque character in its early decades. Ignatius, born to noble family in Guipúzcoa, recruited his first companions from among fellow Basques and other Iberians. Francis Xavier, co-founder of the order, and perhaps Christianity's most successful missionary, came from a Navarrese noble family. Xavier's missions to India, Southeast Asia, and Japan brought thousands into the Catholic Church and established Jesuit presence across maritime Asia. His charisma, courage, and linguistic ability made him legendary. Cade and his letters describing Asian cultures provided European audiences with some of their first detailed knowledge of these distant lands. The Jesuits embraced education as tool for Catholic renewal following the Protestant Reformation. They established colleges throughout Europe and in colonial territories, providing rigorous classical education combined with religious formation. Jesuit institutions in Basque territories educated elite youth, creating networks linking Basque families to broader Catholic, intellectual, and political worlds. The order's emphasis on discipline, learning, and missionary zeal appealed to Basque cultural values, and the society attracted numerous Basque recruits who served in missions spanning the globe. The success of Basque Jesuits reflected a broader pattern of Basque engagement with Catholic renewal. The provinces remained staunchly Catholic during an era of religious upheaval, with Protestantism making virtually no inroads. This religious conservatism, combined with the universal Hidalgo, created what some historians call a Basque ideology, emphasizing old Christian status, purity of blood, untainted by Jewish or Muslim ancestry, and unwavering loyalty to Catholicism. These attitudes, while providing ideological justification for privileges under the fueros, also contributed to intolerance and participation in Inquisition persecutions. The Inquisition operated in Basque territories as elsewhere in Spain, though the population's overwhelmingly Catholic character meant fewer heresy cases than in regions with converso populations, witch hunts in the early 17th century. However, targeted Basque communities, particularly severely. The Zugaram Mordi trials and executions reflected broader European witch hunting mania, with accusations spreading through communities and inquisitors finding evidence of diabolic practices and traditional customs and folklore. The persecution eventually declined after some officials questioned the proceedings. The episode demonstrated that loyalty to Catholicism could not fully protect communities from religious authorities' suspicions. Agricultural innovations slowly transformed rural economy during the early modern period. The introduction of maize from the Americas provided high-yielding crops suited to wet climate, supplementing traditional wheat and millet. Potato cultivation spread gradually, offering another reliable food source that could be grown on marginal lands. These New World crops increased food availability, supporting population growth and reducing vulnerability to harvest failures. The Basari system adapted to incorporate new crops while maintaining traditional structures of family farming and inheritance. Population increased significantly from the 16th through 18th centuries, putting pressure on available land and resources. The Basari inheritance system, preserving farms intact, meant many younger sons and daughters had limited opportunities in agriculture. Immigration provided one outlet, with Basques seeking opportunities in Spain's cities, the colonial empire, or other European regions. The demographic pressure contributed to urbanization as towns and ports absorbed a population that could not be sustained in rural areas. This gradual shift from predominantly rural to more urbanized society would accelerate dramatically in the 19th century. The French side of the Basque country followed different trajectory under French royal authority. The fueros existed there as well, though gradually eroded by French centralization. French Basques participated in France's Atlantic trade and colonial ventures, particularly in the Caribbean. Cayenne became an important port linking French interior to maritime commerce. The linguistic and cultural boundary between French and Basque territories remained fluid, with French language and culture making inroads among urban populations, while rural areas maintained Euskara and traditional customs. Cultural production during the early modern period increased as literacy spread and printing technology became available. The first books in Euskara appeared in the 16th century, primarily religious texts aimed at evangelization. Protestant translations of biblical texts competed with Catholic devotional works, though Protestant influence remained minimal. These early publications established conventions for writing a language previously transmitted almost entirely through oral tradition. The challenge of representing Euskara sounds in Latin alphabet required decisions about spelling and grammar that influenced subsequent literary development. Poetry and oral literature continued flourishing alongside the slowly developing print culture. Bertsalaris adapted their art to changing circumstances, commenting on contemporary events and social changes while maintaining traditional forms. Religious themes entered their repertoire as Christianity thoroughly permeated Basque culture, but secular topics remained important. The oral tradition's vitality meant that most Basques experienced literature and cultural expression through performance rather than reading, making the Bertsalari and traditional singers central to cultural transmission. Architecture from the period shows increasing prosperity and sophistication while maintaining regional character. Urban palaces combined Renaissance and Baroque elements with local building traditions, creating distinctive Basque style. Church construction employed leading architects who introduced latest European fashions while adapting to local conditions and tastes. Town halls and public buildings demonstrated civic pride and economic success. Even rural Basques, still built primarily in traditional styles, incorporated decorative elements and improved construction techniques, reflecting overall prosperity. The 18th century brought Enlightenment ideas even to conservative Basque society. The Royal Basque Society of Friends of the Country, founded in 1765, promoted economic development and education following enlightened principles. The society sponsored agricultural improvements, technical education, and scientific inquiry. It attracted support from progressive nobles and merchants who saw modernization as compatible with maintaining Basque distinctiveness. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and improvement appealed to some Basques seeking to strengthen their society without abandoning fundamental traditions and rights. Trade conflicts with Castile over customs arrangements revealed tensions within the fuero system. Basque provinces' insistence on maintaining customs barriers at the Ebro River frustrated Castilian merchants and royal officials seeking economic integration. Disputes over taxation and contributions to royal expenses created friction. The provinces jealously guarded their privileges, viewing any encroachment as precedent for further erosions of autonomy. These conflicts prefigured more serious struggles that would erupt in the 19th century when Spanish liberalism directly challenged the fueros. Through 3 centuries of incorporation within the Spanish and French monarchies, Basque territories maintained remarkable cultural continuity. Quiros provided legal framework protecting autonomy and rights. Economic success through maritime trade, ironworking, colonial ventures generated wealth supporting population growth and cultural confidence. Universal Hidalgo and Catholic Orthodoxy provided ideological justifications for distinctiveness within larger political units. The Euskara language endured despite increasing bilingualism and Romance influence in coastal areas. The essential elements of Basque identity survived, adapted to new circumstances, but recognizably continuous with earlier periods. The 19th century shattered the delicate equilibrium that had allowed Basque territories to maintain their ancient privileges within the Spanish monarchy. Liberal revolutions sweeping across Europe brought ideologies fundamentally incompatible with the fuero system. Liberals envisioned unified nations governed by constitutions guaranteeing equal rights to all citizens, with centralized administration replacing the patchwork of regional privileges inherited from medieval times. For Basques, this liberal vision threatened the legal foundations of their autonomy, the contractual relationship with the crown that had preserved their distinctiveness for centuries. The conflict between liberal centralization and traditional rights would plunge the region into decades of warfare and transform society beyond recognition. The death of King Ferdinand VII in 1833 triggered succession crisis that became proxy war for competing visions of Spain's future. Ferdinand's brother Carlos claimed the throne, rejecting the pragmatic sanction allowing Ferdinand's daughter Isabella to inherit. Carlism represented more than dynastic legitimism. It championed traditional Catholic monarchy, regional fueros, and resistance to liberal reform. The movement found strongest support in Basque provinces and Navarre, where defense of the fueros motivated thousands to take up arms. For rural Basques, Carlism offered ideological justification for fighting to preserve a way of life threatened by liberal centralizers supporting Isabella's regency. The First Carlist War raged from 1833 to 1840, devastating Basque territories. Carlist forces, drawing recruits from mountain villages and led by commanders intimately familiar with the terrain, fought with determination born of defending homes and traditions. The guerrilla tactics that had served Basque warriors against Romans, Visigoths, and Muslims proved effective against liberal armies initially unprepared for mountain warfare. Carlist bands controlled rural areas while liberal forces held major towns and lines of communication. The war became stalemate, neither side able to achieve decisive victory, both sides inflicting suffering on civilian populations caught between armies. Foreign intervention complicated the conflict. Liberal Spain received support from Britain and France, both seeing strategic advantage in supporting constitutional monarchy against absolutism. The Carlists received more limited aid from absolutist powers and Catholic volunteers from across Europe. The internationalization of what began as Spanish succession dispute demonstrated how regional conflicts in the 19th century connected to broader ideological struggles dividing Europe between liberals and conservatives, publicans and monarchists, anti-clericals and Catholic traditionalists. The war's conclusion through the Convention of Vergara in 1839 preserved the fueros, but in weakened form. Carlist military commander Rafael Maroto negotiated surrender in exchange for promises respecting Basque privileges and integrating Carlist forces into the regular army. General Espartero, leading liberal forces, embraced his defeated opponents and promised generous terms. Yet the agreement's vague language allowed competing interpretations, and subsequent governments chipped away at fuero guarantees. The Basques had fought for their ancient rights and achieved, at best, partial victory. Preservation of forms rather than substance. The uneasy peace lasted only a generation before renewed conflict. The law of 1841 converted Navarre into a Spanish province with limited self-governance, technically respecting the fueros while gutting their content. The other Basque provinces maintained somewhat broader autonomy, but liberal governments progressively reduced their privileges. Each restriction provoked resistance. Each resistance confirmed liberal conviction that the fueros represented anachronistic obstacles to national unity. The conflict was irreconcilable. Liberals believed political equality required uniform law, while Basques insisted that their historical rights deserved respect regardless of liberal ideology. The Second Carlist War, 1846 to 1849, proved briefer and less destructive than the first, but demonstrated continued rural support for Carlism and the fueros. The third and most destructive conflict erupted in 1872, following another disputed succession and continued liberal encroachment on traditional rights. This final Carlist War became the bloodiest, with both sides deploying larger armies and modern weapons. The Carlists, better organized than in previous conflicts, controlled significant territories and besieged Bilbao for months. Liberal forces eventually prevailed through superior resources and modern military organization, but only after years of brutal fighting. The defeat in 1876 led to abolition of the fueros. Liberal government imposed uniform taxation, military conscription, cana, and legal codes across all Spanish territory, ending Basque provinces' special status. The loss devastated rural communities that had fought 3 wars defending ancient privileges. The contractual relationship between Basque territories and the Spanish crown, maintained since the conquest of Navarre, ceased to exist. Basques found themselves reduced to the status of any other Spanish province, their historical rights dismissed as medieval anachronisms incompatible with modern statehood. Yet even as the Carlist Wars destroyed traditional political structures, economic transformation was creating a different Basque society. The discovery of extensive iron ore deposits near Bilbao in the mid-19th century, combined with forests depleted of timber for charcoal, turned Basque iron masters toward modern industrial techniques. The adoption of coal-fired blast furnaces and mechanized production methods required capital investment. Far beyond traditional workshops' capacity, industrialization concentrated in the Bilbao area, where are deposits, ports for importing coal and exporting products, and existing commercial infrastructure created ideal conditions for rapid development. Bilbao transformed from modest port town to industrial metropolis within a generation. Blast furnaces, steel mills, and shipyards lined the Nervion River, their smoke darkening skies that had been clear for millennia. The industrial zone expanded constantly, consuming farmland and small villages in its growth. Population exploded as workers flooded in from rural Basque country, and then from across Spain seeking employment. Teas, though often barely sufficient for survival, exceeded what agricultural labor or declining traditional industries could provide. Thousands abandoned the Biscay system and village life for urban tenements and factory work. San Sebastian followed a different trajectory, developing as elegant resort city, attracting Spanish royalty and European elite. The city's beautiful bay and temperate climate made it ideal vacation destination. An investment poured into hotels, casinos, and the infrastructure of leisure. The contrast with industrial Bilbao could not have been sharper. One city represented industrial modernity's gritty reality, the other its frivolous escapism. Yet both cities drew population from traditional Basque society. Both represented breaking of old patterns, and both became increasingly Spanish-speaking as immigrants from across Spain arrived. The rural-urban divide that had existed in muted form for centuries became chasm. Industrial workers in Bilbao lived lives utterly different from farmers tending Biscay in the hills. The urban working class spoke Castilian or mixed Euskar Castilian, lived in crowded tenements, worked in dangerous conditions for long hours, and developed political consciousness influenced by anarchism and socialism. Rural populations maintained Euskara, worked land their families had occupied for generations, and clung to Catholic traditionalism and memories of the fueros. The two populations increasingly inhabited separate social and cultural universes despite geographic proximity. Migration patterns fundamentally altered demographics. While Basques migrated to industrial cities, far larger numbers of non-Basques arrived from impoverished regions of Spain. Les Maquitos, as Basque speakers called Spanish immigrants, quickly outnumbered ethnic Basques in industrial zones. Keys, Bilbao's explosive growth from 20,000 inhabitants in 1852 over 90,000 by 1900 came primarily from immigration. The demographic shift threatened to overwhelm Basque culture through sheer numbers, as Spanish-speaking workers and their children had little reason to learn Euskara or adopt Basque identity. The industrial bourgeoisie, ironically, often came from old Basque families who had accumulated capital through traditional industries and colonial trade. These industrialists modernized their operations, adopted liberal politics, and intermarried with Castilian elites. They saw themselves as progressive forces, modernizing backward regions, bringing prosperity through industrial development. Their economic power translated into political influence. They dominated local government after the Fueros abolition. Yet their cultural distance from working class, Basques, and recent immigrants created resentment that would fuel nationalist and socialist movements. Into this turbulent environment came Sabino Arana, founder of modern Basque nationalism. Born in 1865 to Carlist family that had suffered for its convictions, Arana grew up surrounded by laws of the wars, laws of the Fueros, laws of traditional society. As a young man studying in Barcelona, he encountered Catalan nationalism and realized that Basque grievances could be articulated through nationalist ideology rather than Carlism's reactionary monarchism. He returned to Bilbao, determined to create a movement defending Basque identity not through restoration of old political forms, but through nationalism adapted to the modern age. Arana's ideology combined romantic ethnic nationalism with Catholic integrism and racial theory fashionable in late 19th century Europe. He portrayed Basques as a distinct race with unique language, customs, and moral qualities superior to Castilian Spaniards. The Maquitos, flooding into industrial cities, represented racial pollution, threatening to extinguish Basque uniqueness. Only through asserting national consciousness and pursuing independence could Basques preserve themselves. This ideology borrowed from European nationalist movements while adding elements specific to Basque circumstances and Arana's particular obsessions. The Basque Nationalist Party, founded in 1895, initially attracted limited support. Urban workers found socialism or anarchism more relevant to their material conditions than ethnic nationalism. Rural populations remained loyal to Carlism and Catholicism, suspicious of novel ideologies. The industrial bourgeoisie embraced Spanish liberalism and had no interest in movements threatening their economic interests. Yet Arana's message resonated with a growing middle class of Basque origin who felt alienated by both cosmopolitan elites and the immigrant-dominated working class. Arana created symbols and vocabulary for Basque nationalism that endured today. He designed the Icariga flag, combining red, white, and green with white cross, giving visual representation to national identity. He promoted use of Basque names over Spanish ones, attempting to rebasquify society he saw as dangerously Hispanicized. He wrote prolifically, producing histories, political treatises, and propaganda that established nationalist discourse. His journalism and speeches, while reaching limited audiences during his lifetime, created intellectual foundations for movements that would grow powerful after his early death in 1903. The nationalism Arana founded defined itself through opposition to Spain, to modernization, to immigration, to secularization. This negative foundation created movement more clear about what it opposed than what it proposed. Different factions interpreted the ideology variously, some emphasizing cultural preservation, others demanding political autonomy, still others insisting on complete independence. The ambiguity allowed the nationalism to spread across political spectrum while preventing unity of purpose. Yet the very existence of organized nationalism marked a fundamental shift in Basque political culture. The Catholic Church's relationship with nationalism proved complex. Arana's integrism aligned with clerical politics, and priests in rural areas often sympathized with the defense of traditional society. Yet the hierarchy remained cautious, remembering how Carlism had compromised the church politically and suspecting that nationalism might lead to similar disasters. Working-class Basques, influenced by anti-clerical socialism and anarchism, rejected nationalism's Catholic character. The urban-rural, clerical-clanical divides cross-cut ethnic and linguistic boundaries, acclimating political culture into competing camps, unable to build broad coalitions. Economic inequality reached extreme levels in industrial zones. Factory owners accumulated enormous wealth, while workers endured poverty, dangerous conditions, and minimal legal protections. Strikes and labor conflicts became routine, often suppressed violently by authorities protecting industrialist interests. The social question dominated politics in urban areas, pushing ethnic and linguistic concerns to periphery for many workers. The failure of nationalism to address class issues limited its appeal among the populations experiencing industrialization's harshest consequences. Women's roles transformed under industrial capitalism's pressures. Working-class women labored in factories or as domestic servants, their wages essential for family survival. Middle-class women found new opportunities in education and white-collar employment, though still constrained by social conventions limiting female independence. Rural women maintained traditional roles managing Basques households, but with declining agricultural prosperity pushing younger generations cityward. The changes created anxiety about gender roles and family structures, fears that nationalists and conservatives exploited in calling for a restoration of traditional society. By 1900, Basque society had experienced more change in a half-century than in the previous 500 years. The ancient furrows lay abolished, traditional economy displaced by industry, demographic composition transformed by immigration, and political culture fractured between competing ideologies. The Euskara language retreated before Castilian in cities and even in some rural areas as schools taught only Spanish, and economic opportunity required linguistic assimilation. Everything that had preserved Basque distinctiveness through millennia seemed threatened with extinction. The question facing the 20th century was whether anything recognizably Basque would survive the ongoing transformations. Spanish Second Republic, proclaimed in 1931 after King Alfonso XIII fled into exile, offered Basque nationalists unprecedented opportunity. The new democratic government proved willing to negotiate autonomy arrangements that would have been unthinkable under the monarchy. After decades of frustration and marginalization, Basque nationalists could participate in crafting political solutions, recognizing the cultural distinctiveness and granting substantial self-governance. Yet the Republic's brief existence and violent end would bring catastrophe beyond anything the Basque country had experienced in its long history of conflicts and conquests. The Basque Nationalist Party, grown considerably since Sabino Arana's death, emerged as dominant political force in the region. The PNV combined Arana's ethnic nationalism with Catholic conservatism and commitment to democratic processes. Its leaders negotiated with Republican authorities for Statute of Autonomy, granting the Basque provinces control over education, taxation, and local governance, while remaining within the Spanish state. Its progress proved slow, as the statute required approval from all provinces, and political factions, suspicious of nationalism, delayed the process. Events would overtake these negotiations before autonomy could be fully implemented. The political landscape remained fractured. Socialist and anarchist unions organized industrial workers around class rather than ethnic identity. Carlists maintained support in rural Navarre and parts of the Basque provinces, their traditionalism fundamentally opposed to Republican secularism. Spanish nationalist right-wing parties attracted conservative middle class, uncomfortable with both socialism and Basque nationalism. This fragmentation meant no single movement could claim to represent Basque society as a whole, each faction competing for legitimacy and power. The military uprising of July 1936, led by generals rejecting the Republic, immediately divided Basque territories. Cañas, a stronghold of Carlism, sided overwhelmingly with the insurgents. Carlis Requetes, traditional militia wearing red berets, formed some of the rebellion's most effective units. They fought not for the rebellious general's fascist vision, but for Catholic traditionalism and against Republican secularism they viewed as threatening civilization itself. Carlis participation demonstrated how religious identity could override ethnic solidarity when fundamental values seemed at stake. The western Basque provinces, particularly Biscay and Gipuzkoa, largely remained loyal to the Republic. The PNV, despite conservative Catholic ideology that might have aligned them with the rebellion, chose Republican loyalty in exchange for immediate grant of autonomy. In October 1936, the autonomous Basque government, formed with PNV leader José Antonio Agri as lehendakari, or president. For brief months, the Basque country exercised self-governance for the first time since the conquest of Navarre over 4 centuries earlier. The experiment would prove tragically short-lived. The autonomous government faced impossible circumstances, surrounded by rebel territory except for a narrow coastal strip blockaded by the insurgent navy, and receiving insufficient support from Republican authorities focused on defending Madrid. The Basque resistance could not long survive. The government attempted to maintain civil order, protect civilians regardless of political affiliation, and organize defense against overwhelming military superiority. Basque forces, primarily militia with limited training and equipment, cased professional military units backed by Italian fascist troops and German air support. German involvement brought modern warfare's horrors to Basque towns. The Condor Legion, sent by Hitler to support Franco and test new tactics and weapons, selected targets across the region. On April 26, 1937, German aircraft bombed Guernica, the ancient town holding deep symbolic importance for Basques. The market day attack killed hundreds of civilians, destroying the town center through incendiary bombs that created firestorm. The methodical targeting of civilian population for maximum terror represented warfare's evolution into total war, where civilian suffering became strategic objective rather than unfortunate consequence. The bombing achieved instant notoriety through international press coverage and Pablo Picasso's artistic response. Picasso, commissioned to create a mural for the Spanish Pavilion at the Paris World's Fair, produced Guernica, his massive canvas depicting war's horror through fractured bodies, screaming figures, and symbolic imagery. The painting became 20th century's most famous anti-war statement, assuring that Guernica would represent not just Basque suffering, but universal victimhood under modern warfare's ruthlessness. The town's destruction achieved mythic status, even as Franco's forces denied responsibility and claimed Basques themselves burned the town. Bilbao fell in June 1937 after brief siege, ending Basque resistance. The autonomous government and thousands of supporters fled into exile, many evacuated by boat to France or England. Children were sent abroad to Britain, Belgium, and the Soviet Union in desperate attempts to save them from war's violence. The exodus created Basque diaspora communities that would maintain Republican loyalty and Basque identity through decades of Franco's dictatorship. These exiles kept alive hope of return and restoration of autonomy that would take nearly 40 years to realize. Franco's victory in 1939 brought dictatorship that would last until his death in 1975. The regime treated Basque provinces as occupied territory, punishment for their Republican loyalty. Special measures beyond even the harsh repression imposed elsewhere targeted Basque culture for eradication. The regime understood that Basque identity represented alternative source of loyalty, challenging the centralized Spanish state it sought to construct. Everything distinguishing Basques became target for suppression in campaigns seeking to make them indistinguishable from other Spaniards. The Euskara language faced systematic assault. Speaking Basque in public spaces became dangerous, liable to provoke harassment or arrest. Schools taught exclusively in Castilian. Children punished for using their native language, even in playgrounds. Publication in Euskara ceased. Earlier books removed from libraries and destroyed. The linguistic repression aimed at nothing less than language death, allowing current generation to die while preventing transmission to their children. Without the language, the regime calculated Basque identity would wither and disappear within a generation or two. Religious practice, paradoxically, provided limited protection for cultural continuity. The Franco regime's national Catholicism sought church legitimacy, teamed extensive institutional presence in Basque country. Some priests, particularly in rural areas, quietly allowed use of euskara in catechism and informal religious instruction. The church's role in cultural preservation created a complex legacy, as the institution supported Franco politically, while individual clergy members helped maintain language and traditions at local level. This ambiguity would later complicate church-state relations when Basque clergy began openly opposing the regime. Economic development under Franco transformed what remained of traditional society. The regime promoted industrialization, seeing economic modernization as compatible with political authoritarianism. Bilbao's industries expanded, drawing continued migration from across Spain. New industrial zones developed around smaller cities, spreading factory employment and urban living patterns. The economic growth benefited regime by raising living standards and creating middle class with stake in political stability. For Basque culture, however, continued immigration and urbanization accelerated the linguistic and demographic shifts, threatening cultural survival. Resistance initially took scattered, uncoordinated forms. Former Republican soldiers continued guerrilla operations in mountains, though Franco's forces systematically hunted them down. Underground networks helped wanted Republicans escape to France. Small groups printed clandestine materials, calling for resistance. The exiled government in Paris claimed continued legitimacy while accomplishing little concrete. Through the 1940s and 1950s, organized opposition seemed futile against regime controlling all institutions and willing to employ brutal repression against suspected dissidents. Euskadi, Ta, Askatasuna, Basque Homeland, and Freedom. Formed in 1959 from frustrated young nationalists convinced that neither the exile government nor the PNV's cautious approach would achieve liberation. ETA's founders, influenced by anti-colonial movements in Algeria and Cuba, embraced revolutionary violence as necessary tool against dictatorship. The organization's ideology combined Marxist revolutionary theory with radical nationalism, framing Basque struggle as anti-colonial fight against Spanish occupation. This fusion of ethnic nationalism and leftist revolution distinguished ETA from earlier Basque political movements. ETA's first actions focused on propaganda and symbolic attacks against regime symbols. Bank robberies funded operations while demonstrating capacity to act against state authority. The organization carefully cultivated image as defenders of Basque people against Spanish oppression, publicizing operations through clandestine communiques and underground publications. The regime's harsh response to even minor opposition helped ETA portray itself as a resistance movement, fighting tyranny rather than criminal organization. The killing of police chief Melitón Manzanas in 1968 marked escalation to systematic assassination campaign. ETA targeted police, military personnel, government officials, and eventually anyone deemed collaborator with oppression. The regime responded with mass arrests, torture, and emergency trials, producing death sentences. The Burgos trial of 1970, where ETA members faced execution, generated international attention and pressure that forced Franco to commute sentences. The trial's publicity paradoxically strengthened ETA by presenting its members as martyrs resisting fascism. The Carrero Blanco assassination in 1973 demonstrated ETA's operational capability and struck directly at regime leadership. Admiral Carrero Blanco, Franco's prime minister and designated successor, died when ETA operatives detonated a massive bomb under his car in Madrid. The attack killed the man who might have continued Francoism after Franco's death, altering Spain's political trajectory. Altamira. The operation proved that armed struggle could affect high politics. For many Basques, including those uncomfortable with violence, it provided satisfaction seeing regime leaders vulnerable after decades of impunity. Franco's death in 1975 opened uncertain transition period. The dictator's designated successor, King Juan Carlos, surprised observers by supporting democratization rather than continuing authoritarian rule. Political prisoners received amnesty, exiles returned, and negotiations began toward new democratic constitution. for Basques. The transition offered possibilities for autonomy and cultural restoration impossible to imagine during dictatorship's darkest years. Yet ETA continued its campaign, arguing that cosmetic changes could not address fundamental injustice of Spanish control over Basque territories. Cultural revival began immediately as restrictions lifted. Castola's Basque language schools, operating semi-clandestinely under Franco, emerged openly and expanded rapidly. Parents, eager to restore language to children, enrolled thousands in programs teaching through euskera. Publishing houses produced books in Basque after decades of prohibition. Radio and television programming in euskera began. Musicians, artists, and writers explored Basque themes and language freely for the first time in a generation. The explosion of cultural activity demonstrated both how much had been suppressed and how much had survived underground. The underground preservation of language and culture represented remarkable collective achievement. Families had maintained euskera in homes, despite risks and pressures toward linguistic assimilation. Communities had preserved traditional music, dance, and customs through informal transmission, even without public performance. The Bertzelares had continued their art in private gatherings. This cultural resistance, sustained through decades without institutional support or legal protection, kept Basque identity alive during its darkest period. The survival ensured that when freedom came, there remained something to revive rather than merely memory of vanished culture. The tension between those supporting peaceful transition to democracy and those demanding revolutionary change would defy Basque politics in coming decades. ETA's continued violence, despite democratization, alienated many Caciques who had sympathized with resistance to dictatorship but rejected terrorism in democratic context. The gulf between maximalist nationalism demanding immediate independence and moderate nationalism seeking autonomy within democratic Spain would divide communities and families. The Civil War and Franco-era's legacy weighed heavily on attempts to build peaceful, democratic society from ruins of dictatorship. The trauma of repression left deep psychological scars. Thousands had been imprisoned, tortured, executed, or forced into exile. Entire communities had experienced occupation by hostile forces, treating them as enemies. Families had lost members to violence from both sides. The suppression of language and culture had attempted to erase identity, accumulated across millennia. This collective trauma could not be healed quickly or easily, particularly while violence continued and political conflicts remained unresolved. The wounds opened during the Civil War and deepened through decades of dictatorship would require generations to heal. The Spanish Constitution of 1978 recognized the right of historic nationalities to autonomy, opening pathways for Basque self-governance that had seemed impossible during Franco's lifetime. The Constituent Assembly included Basque representatives who fought for language, recognizing their distinct identity and right to political autonomy. The compromise document satisfied no one completely, but it created legal framework allowing negotiation of autonomy statutes that could restore substantial self-governance. For the first time since the Republic, Basque political aspirations could be pursued through democratic processes rather than violence or futile resistance. Negotiations for the Basque Statute of Autonomy proceeded through 1978 and 1979, bringing together parties spanning the political spectrum. The PNV played central role, but socialists, communists, and other democratic forces participated in drafting document defining autonomous communities. Powers in relationship to Spanish state. The process required delicate balancing between maximalist demands for near-total independence and minimalist offers of symbolic autonomy. Historical memory of the fueros influenced discussions. Negotiators sought modern equivalents to ancient privileges that had protected Basque distinctiveness for centuries. The statute granted the Basque autonomous community control over education, health, social services, taxation, and police. A Basque parliament and government would exercise these powers, elected by universal suffrage of residents, regardless of ethnic origin. The arrangement restored political autonomy last enjoyed during the brief republic, creating institutions through which Basques could govern themselves in crucial areas affecting daily life and cultural preservation. Taxation powers particularly recalled the fueros, allowing the Basque government to collect taxes and negotiate contributions to central government rather than receiving allocations from Madrid. The referendum on the statute in October 1979 produced overwhelming approval in Gipuzkoa, Biscay, and Araba, though participation rates revealed political divisions. Navarre voted separately on its own autonomy arrangement, choosing separate statute that kept it distinct from the other Basque provinces. This division reflected historical and political differences, with Navarre's Carlist traditions and rural conservatism making it wary of association with the more industrialized and nationalist western provinces. The failure to unite all Basque territories under single autonomous government disappointed radical nationalists who viewed it as acceptance of partition. Carlos Guerreco became first Lehendakar of the autonomous Basque government in 1980, leading PNV Dominited coalition. The new institutions faced enormous challenges establishing themselves while ETA's campaign continued. An economic crisis gripped the region. The government had to build administrative structures, negotiate transfers of powers from Madrid, and demonstrate that autonomy could deliver tangible improvements to citizens' lives. Success required balancing competing demands from those wanting more aggressive assertion of Basque sovereignty and those fearing autonomy would fuel separatism. The Ertzaintza, the autonomous Basque police force, began operations in 1982, taking over public safety responsibilities from Spanish National Police in much of the territory. The creation of indigenous police force represented powerful symbol of self-governance and practical tool for maintaining order according to local preferences rather than central directives. Officers wore distinctive red berets and blue uniforms, visual markers of Basque institutional identity. The Ertzaintza's existence demonstrated that autonomy meant real power, not merely ceremonial recognition of cultural difference. Language policy became autonomous government's most visible cultural initiative. The declaration of Euskara as co-official language with Castilian meant both languages enjoyed legal equality in official contexts. The government established Basque language education system parallel to Spanish language schools, allowing families to choose instruction in either language. Adult education programs in Euskara proliferated, enabling Spanish-speaking adults to learn the language and participate in cultural revival. Television and radio broadcasting in Euskara received public funding, creating media ecosystem supporting language use beyond home and school. Gaztela movement expanded dramatically with official support and funding. Schools teaching entirely or primarily in Euskara multiplied across the autonomous community, enrolling tens of thousands of children whose parents wanted them to acquire fluency in ancestral language. The rapid growth demonstrated pent-up demand suppressed during dictatorship. Within a generation, the percentage of young Basques speaking Euskara rose substantially, reversing decades of linguistic decline. The success of Euskara education became point of pride and evidence that cultural preservation was possible even in modern urbanized society. Economic crisis complicated the transition to democracy and autonomy. The industrial economy built around heavy industry faced structural decline as global competition and technological change made traditional sectors uncompetitive. Steel, mills, and shipyards that had employed tens of thousands closed or downsized drastically. Unemployment reached crisis levels, particularly in working-class neighborhoods dependent on industrial wages. The social costs of deindustrialization created tensions autonomous governments struggled to address with limited resources and powers. Labor conflicts intensified as companies closed facilities and laid off workers. Strikes and protests became routine, some peaceful and others violent. ETA found recruiting opportunities among disaffected youth facing unemployment and seeing no future in legitimate economy. The violence prevented foreign investment that might have eased the transition to post-industrial economy, creating vicious cycle where political instability reinforced economic decline. Breaking this cycle required simultaneously addressing legitimate grievances while isolating violent extremism from broader society. ETA's campaign escalated even as democracy consolidated. The organization killed police, military personnel, politicians, and civilians at increasing rate through the 1980s. The violence traumatized communities, created climate of fear, and poisoned political discourse. Each attack produced grief and rage, hardening positions and making dialogue more difficult. The organization's claim to fight for Basque liberation rang hollow as it killed Basque police officers, Basque politicians, and Basque civilians whose only crime was disagreeing with ETA's methods or politics. The Spanish government's response combined security measures with negotiation attempts. The Gal death squads, operating with apparent state support in the mid-1980s, assassinated ETA members and supporters in France, creating dirty war that compromised democracy's moral authority. The revelation of state involvement in extrajudicial killings scandalized democratic opinion and gave ETA propaganda victories. The episode demonstrated how fighting terrorism could corrupt democratic institutions when security services operated outside legal constraints. Political violence created social divisions that cut through Basque society. Those opposing ETA faced threats, extortion, and assassination. The Kel Barroca, street fighting by radical nationalist youth, harassed perceived enemies through vandalism and low-level violence. The climate of intimidation silenced many who might have spoken against nationalism's violent wing. Communities divided between those sympathizing with ETA's goals, if not methods, and those utterly rejecting political violence. Families split over these questions, friendships ended, and social trust eroded. The economic transformation gradually shifted from crisis to opportunity. The Basque government invested in education, research, and infrastructure, attempting to create knowledge economy, replacing lost industrial jobs. The Mondragon Cooperative Corporation demonstrated alternative economic model combining worker ownership with competitive efficiency. Technology companies and service industries slowly grew, creating new employment even as traditional sectors continued declining. The economic diversification required painful adjustments, but eventually produced more sustainable prosperity. Cultural confidence grew alongside economic recovery. Basque cuisine gained international recognition, with chefs like Juan Mari Arzak pioneering Nueva Cocina Vasca that revolutionized Spanish gastronomy. Atina, the pinso culture of San Sebastian, attracted food enthusiasts worldwide. Traditional sports like pelota maintained popularity while gaining professional organization. Music ranging from traditional folk to punk rock created vibrant scenes expressing Basque identity through diverse styles. The cultural flowering demonstrated that modernity and tradition could coexist. That being Basque meant more than preserving artifacts of the past. The architectural renewal of Bilbao symbolized transformation from industrial city to post-industrial cultural center. The Guggenheim Museum, opened in 1997, became instant landmark whose dramatic titanium-clad form by Frank Gehry attracted visitors globally. The museum's success sparked broader urban renewal, transforming abandoned industrial sites into parks, cultural facilities, and residential neighborhoods. The Bilbao effect demonstrated how cultural investment could revitalize declining cities, creating new economic models based on tourism, culture, and services rather than manufacturing. Cooting, evolution within Basque nationalism created space for peace process. Keys, the PNV's democratic nationalism, committed to achieving independence through legal means and popular will, distanced itself from ETA's violence. Abertzel, left, the radical nationalist movement, politically aligned with ETA, faced internal debates about whether armed struggle remained justified in democratic context. Growing numbers questioned whether violence advanced nationalist goals or hindered them by alienating potential. supporters and justifying Spanish government's refusal to negotiate further autonomy. 1998's ceasefire raised hopes for peace process similar to Northern Ireland's Good Friday Agreement. Negotiations explored whether political accommodations could end violence that had killed over 800 people. The ceasefire collapsed amid mutual recriminations about bad faith, but it demonstrated that ending violence was conceivable. Subsequent truces and negotiations followed similar patterns: progress toward peace, followed by collapse and renewed violence. Each cycle left activists and victims' families more exhausted and skeptical about possibilities for resolution. The terrorist attacks of March 11, 2004, in Madrid, killing nearly 200 people. Initially blamed on ETA before Al-Qaeda responsibility became clear, demonstrated Spanish society's vulnerability to political violence. The attack's aftermath, including government attempts to manipulate information for electoral advantage, revealed dysfunctions in Spanish political system. For Basque society, the attacks reinforced determination to end ETA's campaign. Its association with terrorism became intolerable, regardless of political sympathies. Victims of terrorism organized to demand recognition and oppose any negotiation granting amnesty or political concessions to ETA. Their voices, long marginalized in political discourse, dominated by competing nationalisms, gained moral authority. The Victims' Association's complicated peace process by insisting on justice over reconciliation, punishment over forgiveness. Their position resonated with many Spaniards exhausted by violence and unwilling to grant legitimacy to terrorism through negotiation. The tension between justice and peace, between victims' rights and conflict resolution, made negotiating end to violence agonizing. The permanent ceasefire declared in 2011 finally held, as ETA recognized that armed struggle had failed to advance its goals and had become counterproductive. The organization announced definitive cessation of armed activity, though it did not formally dissolve or apologize for the suffering it caused. The end of violence brought relief, but not reconciliation, as fundamental political disagreements remained unresolved. Questions about responsibility, punishment, and memory divided society even as active conflict ended. The economic crisis, beginning in 2008, tested autonomous institutions' effectiveness. Spain's recession hit hard, with unemployment again reaching crisis levels. The Basque government's fiscal arrangements allowed somewhat greater flexibility than other regions enjoyed, but could not prevent severe hardship. Austerity measures required by economic crisis created political conflicts, as cuts to social services contradicted promises that autonomy would deliver superior governance. The crisis revealed limits of autonomy within larger economic and political systems beyond Basque control. The decades following Franco's death had transformed Basque country from traumatized, oppressed region to autonomous community with vibrant cultural life and substantial self-governance. The journey required navigating between competing visions of Basque future, managing violent conflict while building democratic institutions, and adapting economy from industrial to post-industrial model. The achievements were substantial, but incomplete. Political conflicts remained unresolved, economic challenges continued, and the trauma of violence required healing. The autonomous community entering the 21st century bore little resemblance to the society Franco had attempted to erase. Proof that cultural identity could survive even determined efforts at suppression. The Basque story extends far beyond the Pyrenees valleys where the culture first emerged. For centuries, Basques have immigrated in waves, carrying their language, customs, and identity to distant lands across the Atlantic and Pacific. These diaspora communities created new Basque worlds in Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Mexico, the Philippines, and the Western United States, maintaining cultural traditions while adapting to radically different environments and societies. The immigration, driven by economic necessity, political upheaval, and simple adventurousness, spread Basque influence across the globe while creating transnational networks linking homeland to colonies of immigrants. The earliest significant immigration followed Spanish conquest and colonization of the Americas. Basque sailors, soldiers, and administrators participated in every phase of empire building. Their seafaring skills and commercial acumen making them valuable servants of Spanish crown. The immigration intensified during the 16th and 17th centuries as economic opportunities in the New World attracted those facing limited prospects at home. Younger sons, excluded from Basque inheritance, saw colonial ventures as chance to make fortunes impossible in the crowded valleys of Biscay and Guipúzcoa. South America, particularly the Rio de la Plata region, attracted substantial Basque settlement. Buenos Aires, from its founding, included significant Basque population engaged in commerce and administration. The immigrants established businesses, acquired land, and married into local elite families. Their success created chain migration as established settlers helped relatives and neighbors from home villages immigrate and find employment. By the 19th century, Basques formed influential minority in Argentine society, proportionately represented in commerce, ranching, and politics. The migration reached its peak during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when economic crisis and political upheaval in Basque country combined with labor demand in rapidly developing American economies. Tens of thousands immigrated, fleeing poverty in rural areas affected by agricultural decline and population pressure. The Carlist War's aftermath left defeated communities impoverished and without prospects. Later, the Civil War and Franco dictatorship drove political refugees seeking escape from repression. Each wave added to diaspora communities that eventually numbered in the millions across the Americas. Argentina became the largest destination, with estimates suggesting over 3 million Argentines claim Basque ancestry. The immigrants settled primarily in Buenos Aires and surrounding pampas. Though communities formed in Patagonia and other regions, many became successful ranchers, their pastoral background in the Pyrenees preparing them for managing livestock on the open range. Others entered commerce, establishing businesses that sometimes grew into major enterprises. The concentration of Basques in certain neighborhoods of Buenos Aires created ethnic enclaves where Euskara could be heard in streets and shops, maintaining linguistic islands far from the homeland. Uruguay attracted smaller but still significant Basque population, particularly to Montevideo. The pattern resembled Argentina, with immigrants achieving success in ranching and commerce disproportionate to their numbers. Basque mutual aid societies formed, providing support for new arrivals and maintaining cultural traditions through festivals, language, instruction, and social events. These organizations, called Euskal Etsi, or Basque houses, became community centers where immigrants and their descendants gathered to maintain connections to ancestral culture. Chile received steady Basque immigration, with communities establishing themselves in Santiago and southern regions. Basque surnames became common among Chilean elite, and immigrants' descendants achieved prominence in politics, business, and military. Several Chilean presidents claimed Basque ancestry, evidence of the community's successful integration and ascent to positions of power. The Basque contribution to Chilean nation-building extended beyond elite leadership to include farmers, merchants, and workers who shaped the country's development. Mexico and other Latin American countries hosted smaller Basque communities following similar patterns. Immigrants leveraged commercial skills and family networks to establish businesses serving local and international markets. The communities maintained cultural identity through generations, despite distance from homeland and pressure to assimilate into national cultures. Basque clubs preserved traditions, organized celebrations of Basque festivals, and taught Euskara to children born far from the Pyrenees. The persistence of identity across oceans and generations testified to culture strength and immigrants' determination to remain Basque, even in radically different contexts. The western United States attracted Basque immigrants for different reasons and into different occupations. The California gold rush of 1849 brought adventurous Basques seeking fortune, though few found it in mining. More significant and enduring was the development of sheep ranching across the Great Basin in Mountain West. The vast public lands of Nevada, Idaho, California, and Wyoming provided grazing for millions of sheep. Hand Basques became dominant force in the industry through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Shepherding appealed to Basques for several reasons. The work required little capital to enter, as shepherds could begin as hired workers and eventually acquired their own flocks. The solitary nature of herding suited men accustomed to independence and self-reliance. Caseral skills developed in Pyrenees valleys transferred readily to American ranges, giving Basques competitive advantage. The difficult, lonely work deterred many potential competitors, allowing Basques to dominate the occupation. Within a generation, Basque had become nearly synonymous with sheepherder across the American West. The sheep-herding life proved brutally difficult. Herders spent months alone on the range, tending flocks through all weather conditions. The isolation tested mental resilience as much as physical endurance. Many herders were young men fresh from Basque country, speaking little English and knowing nothing of American society beyond their work. They slept in crude camps, ate simple food, and saw no one for weeks except when supply wagons brought provisions. The psychological toll of such isolation broke some men, while others found peace in solitude and landscapes' vast beauty. Basque boarding houses in towns like Boise, Elko, and Bakersfield provided social centers where herders gathered between work seasons. These establishments offered beds, meals, served family style at long tables, and companionship of fellow Basques. The boarding houses became community institutions, places where new immigrants found jobs, workers exchanged news from home, and cultural traditions were maintained. The Basque language filled dining rooms as herders shared stories and sang traditional songs. For men living isolated lives on the range, the boarding houses represented civilization, community, and connection to cultural roots. Successful herders accumulated capital and transitioned from hired workers to independent operators. They acquired flocks, secured grazing permits, and sometimes purchased ranch land. Some diversified into related businesses, operating hotels, butcher shops, or wool buying operations. The economic mobility possible in the West's open society allowed poor immigrants to achieve prosperity impossible in the stratified societies of Europe or established regions of the Americas. Within a generation, some Basque immigrants became substantial property owners, employing dozens of workers. The prosperity came at cost to environment and existing populations. The massive sheep herds degraded rangelands through overgrazing, destroying native vegetation and causing erosion. Conflicts with cattle ranchers, who viewed sheep as competitors for forage and as damaging to rangeland, sometimes turned violent. Native American populations, already dispossessed of their lands, faced further pressure as Basque and other herders occupied traditional territories. The Basque success in American West involved participation in ecological transformation and displacement of indigenous peoples that characterized Western settlement generally. Cultural preservation in diaspora communities faced constant challenges. The second generation, born in host countries, grew up speaking Spanish, English, or Portuguese as primary languages. Euskara became language of grandparents, used in diminishing contexts as younger generations assimilated linguistically. The economic and social pressures toward assimilation proved powerful, as success often required abandoning ethnic identification for national identity. Yet, many families maintained Basque consciousness across generations, instilling pride in heritage even as practical use of language and customs declined. The Basque clubs and cultural centers became crucial institutions for identity maintenance. These organizations sponsored traditional dance groups, language classes, and sports competitions. They celebrated Basque holidays like Aberi Iguna and organize annual festivals featuring traditional music, dance, and food. The cultural activities connected diaspora communities to homeland traditions while creating new forms of Basque identity specific to immigrant contexts. Being Basque in Buenos Aires or Boise meant something different than being Basque in Bilbao, but the shared sense of distinctiveness persisted. The cuisine became a powerful vehicle for cultural preservation. Basque restaurants in diaspora communities served traditional dishes to immigrants and introduced local populations to the region's culinary traditions. The boarding houses in the American West became famous for abundant meals featuring lamb, beans, and other traditional foods. In Argentina, Basque restaurants became institutions in their own right, some operating continuously for over a century. Food maintained cultural connections when language faded, providing tangible, sensory link to ancestral culture. Political developments in homeland affected diaspora communities profoundly. The Spanish Civil War divided communities between those supporting Republic and those sympathizing with Franco. The conflicts and divisions of the homeland reproduced themselves in Buenos Aires and Boise, sometimes tearing communities apart. Later, debates over ETA's violence created similar rifts, with some defending armed struggle as legitimate resistance, while others condemned terrorism. The diaspora could not escape politics of the homeland despite geographic distance. The relationship between homeland and diaspora evolved across generations. First-generation immigrants maintained strong emotional and often practical ties, sending remittances to family members and dreaming of eventual return. Second and third generations identified as Basque but often had never visited ancestral lands. Later generations might retain surname and vague awareness of Basque heritage, but little active connection to culture. Yet each generation included individuals passionate about maintaining heritage, learning Euskara, and strengthening ties to contemporary Basque country. Modern transportation and communication transformed diaspora experience. Air travel made visiting homeland feasible, allowing immigrants and descendants to experience Basque country directly rather than through family stories. The internet connected diaspora communities to each other and to cultural developments in the autonomous community. Basque government programs reached out to diaspora, providing resources for language learning and cultural programming. The relationship became more dynamic and reciprocal, with diaspora communities contributing to homeland culture even as they drew from it. The role of diaspora in Basque nation building and cultural preservation deserves recognition alongside homeland struggles. When Franco suppressed Euskara, diaspora communities maintained the language in exile. When political expression became impossible under dictatorship, immigrants kept alive democratic nationalism in memory of republic. The diaspora provided material support for resistance movements and safe havens for political refugees. Without the diaspora's preservation of culture and political alternatives, the revival following Franco's death would have faced greater challenges. Economics of remittances flow in complex directions. Initially, successful immigrants sent money to impoverished families in homeland, providing crucial support during difficult times. More recently, some diaspora communities have struggled economically while the autonomous community prospered, reversing traditional patterns. The Basque government now provides resources supporting diaspora cultural activities, recognizing their role in spreading Basque culture globally and maintaining international networks beneficial to contemporary Basque society. The question of identity persists across generations. What makes someone Basque when they have never lived in Basque country, speak no Euskara, and live lives utterly different from ancestors who immigrated generations ago? The diaspora answers vary, some emphasizing blood descent, others cultural practice, still others simply emotional identification with heritage. The multiplicity of answers reflects reality that Basque identity, like all ethnic identities, is constructed and negotiated rather than fixed and essential. The diaspora creates new versions of being Basque, enriching rather than diluting the culture through their diverse experiences and perspectives. The threads of connection that stretch across oceans continue to pulse with life in the 21st century. Basque descendants in Buenos Aires, in Boise, in Santiago, and San Francisco maintain bonds with a homeland many have never seen. Yet, it is in the green valleys and coastal cities of the Basque country itself that the most remarkable chapter of this ancient story now unfolds. A people who have survived Roman legions and Visigothic kingdoms, Franco's persecution, and the trauma of terrorism, have emerged into the modern era with their identity not merely intact, but thriving in ways that would have seemed impossible just decades ago. The autonomous community that exists today represents the most extensive self-governance the Basque people have enjoyed in 5 centuries. The Statute of Autonomy granted powers that go far beyond those of typical regional governments. The Basque country collects its own taxes, maintains its own police force, controls its own education and healthcare systems, and operates with a degree of fiscal independence unique in Europe. The ancient principle of the fueros, those medieval rights that guaranteed local autonomy, has found its modern expression in institutions that would have been recognizable to the medieval lords of Navarre. Bilbao stands as the most visible symbol of this transformation. The city that was once synonymous with industrial decline and political violence has reinvented itself as a model of urban renewal. The Guggenheim Museum, designed by Frank Gehry and opened in 1997, became more than an architectural marvel. It catalyzed a complete reimagining of what the Basque country could become. The titanium curves that rise beside the Nervion River attract millions of visitors each year, but the museum represents something deeper. It announced to the world that this ancient people were not content to be museum pieces themselves, but intended to participate fully in the cultural conversations of the contemporary world. The economic success of the modern Basque country challenges conventional models of regional development. With a population of barely 2 million, the autonomous community generates wealth and innovation at levels that rival much larger nations. Unemployment rates consistently run below the Spanish average. Per capita income exceeds the European Union mean. The industrial heritage that once seemed like a burden has been transformed into an advantage. Its manufacturing expertise evolved into precision engineering, aerospace components, and advanced materials. At the heart of this economic model lies one of the world's most successful experiments in cooperative enterprise. The Mondragon Corporation began in 1956 when a young priest named Jose Maria Arizmendiaria organized a small group of workers to manufacture paraffin heaters. From these modest beginnings grew a federation of cooperatives that now employs over 80,000 people and generates revenues exceeding 12 billion euros annually. Its principles that guide Mondragon would have been familiar to the medieval Basques who gathered at the Oak of Guernica to deliberate on matters of common concern. Decisions are made democratically. Wage differentials between the highest and lowest paid workers remain modest by corporate standards. Profits are shared among worker owners rather than extracted by distant shareholders. The cooperative model reflects something essential about Basque character: a deep suspicion of hierarchy and an equally deep commitment to communal solidarity. These values did not emerge from ideology, but from centuries of practical experience. Mountain communities learned that survival depended on cooperation, that the Biscay farmstead functioned because every member contributed according to their ability. Fishing villages knew that the sea was too dangerous and the catch too uncertain for individual enterprise alone. When modern economic theory celebrates competition and individual maximization, the Basque experience offers a different vision. The revival of Euskara represents perhaps the most improbable success of all. A language that Franco tried to exterminate, that seemed destined for extinction as Spanish dominated every sphere of public life, has experienced a renaissance that linguists regard with something approaching. The Icastala schools that taught in Basque, despite prohibition, have multiplied into a comprehensive educational system. Children now grow up fully bilingual, often trilingual, moving effortlessly between Euskara and Spanish. University courses are taught in the ancient tongue. Television programs and newspapers proliferate in a language that has no proven relatives anywhere on Earth. The numbers tell a story of determined recovery. In the decades immediately following Franco's death, barely 20% of the population could speak Euskara fluently. Today, that figure has risen to over 30% and continues to climb. Among young people, the percentages are higher still. The language spoken by Paleolithic hunters, a tongue that has outlasted every imperial power that sought to eliminate it, is gaining speakers in the age of global English. Something in the Basque soul recognized that without the language, the identity itself would eventually dissolve. They chose to fight for their words. Cultural confidence extends beyond language into every domain of expression. K's cuisine has achieved international recognition that would have astonished earlier generations. San Sebastian now rivals any city on earth for the density of Michelin stars. Chefs like Juan Mari Arzak and Martin Barusa have transformed the simple traditions of Basque cooking into a form of high art. While Pinso's bars continue to serve the small plates that have sustained workers and fishermen for centuries, it's a combination of innovation and tradition characterizes the Basque approach to gastronomy, as it does so many other aspects of their culture. Traditional sports have found new audiences in the modern era. Pelota courts echo with the crack of the ball against ancient walls, and championships draw crowds that rival major professional leagues. Stone lifting and wood chopping and other rural sports have evolved from practical competitions between farmers into celebrated athletic events. The Bertsolariac, those improvising poets who compose verses in real time on assigned topics, hack auditoriums with audiences who follow the verbal jousting with the intensity of sports fans anywhere. Yet, for all the success and renewal, the deep mysteries remain unsolved. The question that has haunted researchers for centuries still lacks a definitive answer. Where did the Basques come from? How did the people speaking an unrelated language survive the great migrations that transformed everyone around them? Why does Euskara stand alone, an orphan tongue without siblings or cousins, anywhere in the linguistic family trees of humanity? Modern genetics has added fascinating data without providing final resolution. Studies of DNA revealed that the Basques carry genetic markers found throughout Western Europe, markers associated with the repopulation of the continent after the last ice age. They are not as genetically distinct as earlier researchers believed, not a completely separate population that somehow avoided mixture with the neighboring peoples. Yet, certain patterns do distinguish them. The highest frequencies of the O-negative blood type occur in Basque populations. Certain mitochondrial DNA lineages appear with unusual regularity. The arrival of Indo-European languages and peoples transformed most of Europe between 4,000 and 2,000 years before the Common Era. Agricultural societies expanded from their origins in Anatolia and the steppes, carrying with them languages ancestral to Celtic and Germanic and Italic and Slavic tongues. Almost everywhere they went, the older languages disappeared, absorbed or eliminated by the newcomers. Yet, in the mountain valleys of the Western Pyrenees, something different happened. The pre-Indo-European population and their language persisted through geographic isolation or cultural resistance or simple demographic resilience. Some researchers now propose that Euskara represents the last survivor of a linguistic family that once extended across much of Europe before the Indo-European expansion. The continent was home to languages we can barely reconstruct, tongues known only from place names and fragmentary inscriptions. The Iberian language of eastern Spain, the Pictish of Scotland, the Etruscan of Italy, all have vanished, leaving only tantalizing traces. Euskara alone continues to be spoken, a living fossil of the linguistic diversity that characterized prehistoric Europe. The cave paintings of the region take on additional significance in this light. the magnificent bison and horses of Altamira. The handprints and abstract symbols of dozens of smaller caves were created by people who are almost certainly ancestral to the modern Basques. Genetic continuity in the region extends back at least 10,000 years and likely much further. The artists who worked by flickering torchlight in those underground galleries spoke languages that eventually evolved into Euskara. The spiritual beliefs that motivated their paintings may survive in transformed form in the mythology of Mari and Basijan. This extraordinary continuity raises questions that touch on the deepest aspects of human identity. What allows a culture to persist for so long? The Basques have no sacred texts that preserved their traditions across millennia, no priestly class dedicated to maintaining orthodoxy. Perhaps the answer lies in patterns of social organization and values that proved resilient across changing circumstances. The decentralized structure of traditional Basque society may have contributed to this resilience. Without centralized institutions that could be captured and redirected, the culture existed in thousands of villages and households. Eliminating Basque identity would have required eliminating every family and every small community where the old ways were practiced. The relationship between the Basques and their landscape has proven crucial. The mountains provided refuge during invasions, but more than that, they shaped a distinctive way of life. The pattern of dispersed farmsteads rather than nucleated villages. The transhumance that moved flocks between winter and summer pastures. The forestry and mining that supplemented agriculture. All these adaptations to challenging terrain created a society different from the grain-growing plains that surrounded it. Geography favored small-scale independence and communal cooperation over centralized control. The end of ETA's armed campaign in 2011 removed a source of violence and division that had shaped life for half a century. The process of coming to terms with that painful history continues, with efforts to acknowledge victims and establish historical truth. The wounds heal slowly, but the absence of political violence has allowed energy to flow into other channels. Cultural and economic development proceeds without the shadow of terrorism that haunted earlier decades. Climate change poses new threats to a region whose identity is bound up with its landscape. The Atlantic climate that produces the green hills and temperate weather faces disruption as global temperatures rise. Fishing stocks that sustained coastal communities for millennia are shifting northward. Agricultural patterns developed over centuries may need to adapt to new conditions. The Basques have survived many transformations, but the environmental challenges of the coming decades will test their adaptive capacity in new ways. The question of political status remains unresolved. Independence movements draw significant support, particularly among younger Basques. Others prefer continued autonomy within Spain, satisfied with the current arrangement or concerned about risks of separation. The peaceful, democratic nature of this debate represents progress from the bitter conflicts of the past. Whatever the political future holds, the cultural identity seems secure. When darkness falls over the Basque country, when the lights of San Sebastian reflect in the waters of the Bay of Biscay and shepherds settle their flocks in mountain pastures, something ancient continues. The language spoken in those homes connects directly to prehistoric Europe. The values of community and independence that guide daily life carry forward traditions older than written history. The mysterious origins, the linguistic isolation, Conti, the genetic continuity, all these make the Basques unique among European peoples. The tale of the Basques may never be fully solved. Future archaeological discoveries might illuminate the prehistoric past. Genetic studies might reveal patterns not yet detected. Or the mystery might endure, a permanent reminder that the human story contains depths we cannot fully plumb. The Basques resist easy categorization, refuse to fit neatly into conventional narratives of European history. Their persistence is a kind of ongoing miracle, renewed in every generation that learns the ancient tongue and carries forward the ancient ways. Sleep comes easily in the Basque country, in villages nestled in green valleys. in cities washed by Atlantic rains, in farmhouses that have sheltered families for centuries. The same stars that guided Paleolithic hunters shine over their descendants tonight. The same mountains that have protected this people since before history rise in the darkness, and in the dreams of sleeping children who will wake tomorrow to speak the oldest language in Europe. The long story continues, carrying its mysteries and marvels into an uncertain but promising future. The Basques have survived everything that history has thrown at them. There is no reason to believe they will not survive whatever comes next. Their story is not finished. Perhaps it never will be.